Folks, let me start out with a simple statement of fact. I'm not all that good at games. I'm no pro, I ain't hardcore, I'm not special, I am mid, as the kids say nowadays. Nonetheless, I really do love me some Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, to the extent that I've clocked in well over 1,000 hours of playtime across these games, with Elden Ring being the one I've played most. Like I said, I'm not that good at games, but to be fair to myself, nor am I bad. And to that point, a couple of years ago before I'd even started this channel, I decided I fancied taking on Dark Souls 3 at level 1. And then afterwards, Bloodborne at level 4. I shan't lie, I had a damn tough but very fun and engaging time doing this, though I confess I did only beat the mandatory bosses in each game, and I didn't go near the DLCs because I was afraid. Thing is, after spending about 8 hours banging my head against Dark Souls 3's Soul of Cinder, and then about the same amount of time on Bloodborne's Gehrman before eventually taking them down, I started to think some thoughts, disgusting thoughts. I started to develop ideas above my station. I thought, I wonder if I can beat Elden Ring at level 1. And not just the mandatory bosses, but every Remembrance boss. And folks, that's exactly what I ended up doing, nearly. Yes indeed, with the exception of Malenia, I did succeed in beating every Remembrance boss at level 1. Don't get me wrong, I tried to beat Malenia. In fact, I spent an entire weekend glued to my sofa trying, but I did not succeed, and I ended up getting so pissed off and bitter after literally over 20 hours worth of attempts that I ended up saying, you know what, bugger this, before crossing my character over to New Game Plus so that I couldn't keep trying to beat her, because it was making me miserable and a little bit loopy, and it stopped being fun. Fast forward a couple of years, when a few weeks ago I randomly thought to myself, I never did beat Malenia. I do have a YouTube channel now, and I feel like a bit of a challenge, so hey. Why not go through the whole rigmarole once again, but this time make an amusing video about it, just in time for Christmas. And this time, I will beat Malenia. Or will I? Folks, this run, whilst bringing me a whole lot of pleasure, also brought me a great deal of pain, hence the title of this video, a video in which I will be discussing and analysing nearly all the bosses I fought, to let you know what they were like to take on with such shitty stats and low HP, to testify as to what I enjoyed about these battles and what I most certainly did not enjoy, and to aid in that, for each boss I will also give a pain rating out of 10 and a pleasure rating, based on how they made me feel on this particular run. Some of these bosses were a treat, but a few others sucked! And I just can't wait to tell you all about it. Must also mention that this video is just the base game bosses, and furthermore, I didn't use any Shadow of the Erdtree equipment or items to help me here. The DLC stuff is going to be for my next video, and I'm not looking forward to it. Anyway, enough jibber jabber. Let's get this show on the road. Behold, Candle Type Level 1A. The beginning. We've got a long road ahead of us. For clarity, when I did my last level 1 run, the one and only thing I was strict about was staying at level 1, with everything else being fair game, meaning I wore armour and made frequent use of NPC phantoms and spirit ashes and stuff. For this run, however, I wanted to up the ante just a bit, and so I didn't equip any armour whatsoever. This might seem like a minor handicap in a run where many attacks will kill you regardless of whether or not you're wearing armour, but there's also the stat aspect to consider. Gear like the Omen Smirk Mask, Silver Tear Mask, and Haligtree Night Helm, to name but a few examples, all provide increases to particular stats, which can really matter in a level 1 run where even minor stat boosts can be incredibly meaningful. That said, Elden Ring is a game with several other ways to raise your core stats, with talismans and Godrick's Great Rune and such, and furthermore, because I wasn't wearing any armour in this playthrough, I was able to stay light rolling the whole time. Hey, not bad. The other handicap I imposed upon myself was that this time I would not summon a single solitary spirit to aid me in my journey. No phantoms for the Radahn battle, no Knight Bernal for the Godskin Duo, and not a Black Knife Tiche in sight, and this definitely made conditions far rougher this time round, particularly for some bosses. I know some brave people go even further on level 1 runs where they don't even reinforce their weapons, don't equip talismans, and don't use Ashes of War, but I freely admit that those folks are on a whole different league to me. Like I said, I'm generally not spectacular at games, and I'm certainly not that good. I'm just a humble simpleton from Scotland who wears his heart on his sleeve. The beginning of a level 1 run, whilst not being exactly easy, really isn't that much different from a regular old run, except as per the deprived class, you start off butt naked, get used to constantly seeing this arse over the next 2 hours, and you start off armed with a plain old club. A thoroughly modest weapon, though one which certainly can do a perfectly adequate job at nailing Limgrave's early enemies, even unreinforced. I gave the Grafted Scion a bloody good go, but as always, I got wrecked. I have never even gotten close to beating this bastard on a fresh new game, but that's fine because I actually don't even want to beat it. I'll tell you who I can beat though, and that's this dickhead. Never mind Soldier of Godrick though, sure he gave me a bit of a warm-up, but I was looking for something a bit spicier to get the blood really pumping. This guy, the one with the form of a tree atop his head. Not a mandatory boss of course, but from time to time in this run I did take on optional bosses, sometimes for business, so as to obtain a talisman or some such, and other times for pleasure, with the Tree Sentinel falling into the latter category. Pleasure me, Tree Sentinel. Pleasure me. I've always liked this boss. In fact, now that I think about it, I like the hell out of every mounted boss in Elden Ring, though not sure whether I prefer these guys or the Draconic Tree Sentinels. Yeah, now that I think about it, I prefer the regular Tree Sentinels. Though it doesn't matter if you're starting out as a level 1 Deprived or a level 10 Confessor, this unit is going to give you some trouble. Of course, as with several early game encounters, the game design thrust here is clearly that you give this fight a go, get your arse handed to you on a gold platter, go away, get better gear, level up, then come back and hand its ass to it. Except, Thankfully, I've got so much experience grinding against the Tree Sentinel early on in playthroughs that I know its moveset extremely well at this point. Not enough to take it down hitless, but where I found myself getting the groove pretty much straight away, where I managed to not get too intimidated by those big impactful shield charges and ground pound AoE slams that would surely wreak havoc upon my character's beautiful naked body. I managed to take down the Tree Sentinel on my 3rd attempt, which I thought was fairly respectable, making for a nice, enjoyable start to what would inevitably be a long, hard journey. Got myself a golden halberd, which I never at any point used throughout this run, but hey, thanks anyway, and a few thousand runes, which, generally speaking, were still important for this playthrough. Even though I wouldn't be leveling up at any point, I still always made sure to buy any useful items and crafting recipes from merchants. And smithing stones don't come cheap either, don't you know? Never mind that though, my ratings. I give the Tree Sentinel just a 1.5 on the pain scale and a nice 8 on the pleasure meter. Really fun fight that's challenging without being frustrating. Sure, I died a couple of times, but yeah, that's gonna happen a bunch. This shit's hard. I'm feeling stimulated, I said to myself after nailing the Sentinel. I've never felt so aroused in all my life, I continued. But am I ready for Margit at the moment? Do I want to just go in there and start bonking him on the head with my crummy old club? I asked. No, was the answer. Like I said, perfectly serviceable early game weapon, the club, but I fancied myself something a wee bit more versatile at this point, and so equipped a Lordsworn Straightsword, as dropped by a Godrick soldier at the Gatefront Ruins, a weapon which I'd stick with for the first chunk of the game. I'll say this now by the way, that I did not go into this run with optimality in mind. Nothing was really planned out, there were great talismans that I ignored for most of the run, and I barely bothered at all with damage buff items. I'm the sort of dude who, if something's working, will just stick with it for as long as possible until I absolutely have to make a change. Which, as you'll see at certain points in this run, I did have to do. Anyway, sure, the Tree Sentinel got my blood running a bit hot, but before daring to challenge the fell Omen, I'd fancied taking on a dragon. Agheel, the Lord of the Lake. You see me here chatting to Yura, who you can of course summon in for the battle, because at this point in the run, I hadn't yet finalised the specifics of the run. But be assured, I went on to fell the dragon alone, and everything else for that matter. Agheel is actually the only regular dragon boss I took on in the entire playthrough, with the ancient likes of Fortissax and Placidusax being far different beasts with very different movesets. Again, didn't have to fight Agheel at all, and I didn't at any point make use of the dragon heart that you get as a reward for victory, but you know how it is. You've just started your journey and you've got this big bursting world to explore, and sometimes you just want to f*** up a dragon. Short of the lesser dragons stomping round in Grail's dragon barrow, Agheel really is about as basic as they come. All its attacks are quite vanilla, with no fancy elemental twists or nasty status effects to worry about. That said, this boss still was not as much of a pushover as I would have liked, with Agheel being so mobile, making use of a large portion of the lake's area through sweeping flights and air-to-ground charge slams. I stayed up on Torrent for most of the battle, making clearing those one-shot KOing flame swaves far more doable than if I was on foot. Though due to the lack of iframes when horsed, I did dismount when appropriate for when Agheel did his air-to-ground dive bomb. This is of course the first dragon you encounter in the world, but that doesn't mean it goes down all too easy. The Tree Sentinel is a beefy opponent with its nearly 3000 HP, but Agheel has more HP still, and thanks to its tendency to fly away as often as it does, sometimes to irritatingly awkward and visually disconcerting places, you won't be allowed to attack constantly, potentially leading to a rather drawn out affair, one which can very easily be swiftly and scorchingly ended if you make one wrong move, and oh look, shit, I've been burnt to a crisp. Like I said, Agheel would be the only non-ancient dragon I take on in this run, not just because you don't have to fight any others, but because, quite frankly, I found fighting it to be a bit of a bloody ball ache. It's irritating enough already when some dumb dragon starts flying around erratically and generally behaving like a fool, but it's extra grating when you're running around at little old level 1 when pretty much any of the dragon's attacks can kill you. I hereby award Agheel a 4 on both the pain and pleasure scales. But was I prepared to take on my boy Margit now? Yeah, I guess, but there was one more challenger that I wanted to challenge before progressing onwards to Stormhill Castle, just to see how I'd fare against it at this early juncture. I'm referring to the Stormhill Crucible Knight. I bloody adore fighting the many Crucible Knights scattered throughout the lands between, both the Tree and Axehelm variants, though like many, I'm not quite so big a fan when the two are combined. Crucible Knights are pretty much always a challenge wherever you find them, thanks to their intimidating and impactful combos, troublesome follow-ups, and their tendency to catch you out with a final sudden thrust just when you think you've got a bit of time to heal up. Depending on precisely which knight you're fighting, they do of course also throw out various aspects of the Crucible attacks to spice things up, but these battles are largely about fast-paced, close quarters combat, constant exchanges of blows where consistent and precise timing is demanded of the player, especially if they are on level 1. Just like the Tree Sentinel and Agheel, the Stormhill Evergaol is something most first-time players will try, get annihilated by this sword-wielding, horn-shielding knight of the Primordial Current, and then think, yeah, I'm going to come back later on. The Crucible Knight is hard, and is undoubtedly far more highly tuned, difficulty-wise, than almost any other enemy or boss in Limgrave, something to return to a few hours in, perhaps after nailing Godrick. Well, I actually fancy myself as someone who's fairly adept at handling Crucible Knights, because I really like fighting them, and I've spent many hours fighting them. Turns out though, and you're not going to believe this, but turns out that, in reality, I f***ing suck. I began my attempts by taking it on conventionally, two-handing my Lord Swan straight sword and endeavouring to simply dodge every attack and then follow it up with well-considered punishes. Quickly realised that it wasn't going to be quite as straightforward as that though. My damage was piss, meaning that not only did I have to perform well, but that I'd have to do so consistently for several minutes to deplete the bosses near 3000 HP. Thus, I changed tactics and returned with a shield with ambitions to parry my way to victory. Now, I'm far from any sort of parry god, but I did do a run a few months back when I used a buckler equipped with the golden parry Ash of War for most of the playthrough, and it was super effective, trivialising some enemies, one of which was Crucible Knights. However, didn't have any small shields on me, just a medium one, and turned out my parrying skills weren't really up to scratch. I'd get one off occasionally, but not as consistently as was needed, and the punishment for a mistimed parry was usually death. I'd love to sit here and tell you that I persevered, got better at parrying, and crucified the Crucible Knight, but instead I got a bit annoyed and left. I did come back later on though, after clearing Stormhill Castle, this time with my weapon upgraded to +4, with a better shield and the curved sword and claw talismans equipped. Though it was still a tough fight, which I only scraped through by the skin of my teeth. Again, didn't need to bother with this Everjail, but I did bother with it, and I felt thoroughly warmed up after it. I would give the Stormhill Crucible Knight a 5 on the pain scale and a 6.5 on the pleasure scale. You might think I'd give it a higher pain rating due to how many times I got, nailed, and how I had to postpone the fight till slightly later on in the run, but I must stress that there's a big difference between a boss fight being truly painful and it being very challenging. Challenging is fun and enjoyable, but believe me, several bosses in this level 1 run very much cross the threshold into the valley of pain. Okay then, enough postponement of the inevitable. It was finally time to take on Margit Fell Omen. I was a bit nervous, because truth be told, this is not a boss I've ever gotten all that good at. For as tough as the aforementioned encounters can be at the beginning of any playthrough, Margit's in a different league, boasting a very complex moveset for a boss fought so early on in the game. He's big, swift, mobile, has excellent range with his long cane weapon, and he can punish ill-timed casts or heals from range with his magic daggers attack. Margit also has a distinct second phase where he gains new moves, increasing the intensity of this already rather intense fight, and furthermore, this is where the player really gets their introduction to Elden Ring's infamous delayed attacks, those exaggerated wind-ups that range from being difficult all the way to practically impossible to time the first time you see them, where the game deliberately tricks you into rolling earlier or later than you should. The game takes the word rolling and adds the letter T at the beginning. Margit has more HP than the Grafted Scion, the Tree Sentinel, Flying Dragon Agheel, or the Stormhill Crucible Knight, meaning you pretty much just have to learn his shit well enough to be able to come out on top. Now, normally by this point you can use Spirit Ashes, and due to how much of the world the game lets you explore before taking Margit on, there's a wealth of great ones you can get your hands on. One I used on my very first playthrough was the Rotten Strays, that I picked up in Caelid after getting warped there from the Dragon Burnt Ruins, allowing you to inflict Scarlet Rot on the boss, though even the plain old Spirit Jellyfish you can get from Rodrika does a surprisingly great job, drawing Margit's attention away from you a bunch and being capable of inflicting him with poison, or why not summon in Sorcerer Rogier for the fight, whose summon sign lies just by the Fog Gate. I'll tell you why not, because this is a no summon run and I'm not allowed. In the end, Margit ended up being not as tough an opponent as I'd feared he might. I did die a few times, of course, but even on my failed attempts, I'd still get him down to phase 2 before getting split open by some almighty crack of his cane or swing of his spectral giant crusher. There are a bunch of bosses in this run where what makes them so tough is one or more specific attacks that may be really difficult to avoid, but Margit didn't have anything particularly problematic for me. When I died, it was just because I'd played poorly, rather than it being because of some annoying bastard of a special attack, which is good. I like a straight fight between gentlemen. Margit gets a 3.5 on the pain scale and a 6 for pleasure. Decent fight that took me no longer than, say, 20 minutes to clear, though bear in mind that we're still in the stage of the run where the stat difference between my character and a character on a normal run really isn't that significant. Sure, Margit's one tough customer and a very significant character in the game's story, one which we will of course be seeing again when we make it to Leyndell, but here in Limgrave, he's mainly just a skill check, a roadblock, a hurdle to clear before you infiltrate into Stormhill Castle, where the grafted demigod awaits, Godrick. I'm not really interested in getting too much into the stuff between the game's bosses for this video, because the fact is that you can just run past everything. There's really no reason to waste time getting distracted by regular enemies. That said, I'd be lying if I said that my trek through the castle was an entirely smooth one. I died many times, sometimes like this. Or other times like this, you know, at the exact same section, like a moron. Did make sure to pick up the Claw Talisman from here, which I'd go on to have equipped for almost the entire run, and would even use for the final boss. Jump attacks are very powerful, and the posture damage they do is especially useful for a level 1 run, where staggers are massively meaningful and can be the difference between a win or a loss. As for Godrick the Grafted, well, just as with many bosses from this awesome game, I love him to bits. I love his character, his cutscenes, his design, and of course, the battle itself. In fact, he's one of my top 10 favourite FromSoft bosses. As far as his difficulty goes, I think Godrick is wonderfully tuned. The Tree Sentinel and Margit encounters can feel brutal and unyielding, at least initially, but I've never really felt that way about Godrick, though that's not to say he's easy, and I remember him giving me some trouble on my last level 1 run, even with me using Spirit Ashes back then. However, I surprised the crap out of myself this time and ended up beating the ugly son of a bitch on my first damn attempt. Now, it wasn't a flawless victory by any means, because I did get tagged a few times in Phase 2 after getting a bit overzealous with my offense, but we're still in the early stages of the run where, even without armor, you can still survive a hit here or there. I just know how to deal with pretty much everything that Godrick can throw out, and if you're close to him when he initiates his Dragon Arms moving Fire Breath attack, you can just go to town on him, though also observe my use of the Impaling Thrust Ash of War, a very basic but, in my opinion, extremely effective skill for dealing damage and breaking posture. You know what, I'm going to give Godrick a 1 on the pain scale because he caused me no pain whatsoever. Didn't even die once, somehow. And on the pleasure scale, I'm throwing out a 9. Felt damn good taking him down first time, and Godrick just makes for a super enjoyable fight in general. First Remembrance boss down, and first Great Rune secured. After taking down Godrick, I felt like having a bit of an indulgent wander before progressing outright onto Liarnea, and so made the usual trip down to the Weeping Peninsula for some smithing stones, golden seeds and sacred tears, and I also paid a visit to the Third Church of Marika to pick up the Flask of Wondrous Physic, a tool which, as you might imagine, is very, very important for a level 1 run, though at this early stage it doesn't have too much of an impact. Speaking of the Wondrous Flask, it's nearly useless without a selection of crystal tears to equip it with, and so throughout this run I made sure to fight just about every single Erdtree avatar, starting with the one at the Weeping Peninsula, though to be honest, initially I didn't even do this specifically for crystal tears. I just really enjoy fighting Erdtree avatars, though it does bug me when they spam their golden land lasers, and I also dislike it when the putrid ones spam their slamming ass attack that sprays shit everywhere. Knock it off. There was another reason I was here in the Peninsula though, and that was to pick up Radagon's Scar Seal from the Weeping Evergaol, a reward for beating the ancient hero of Zamor. I'm not going to spend any time discussing this fight because it's just a regular enemy with a boss health bar, and it's also not an enemy I actually really enjoy fighting at all or find interesting. The important part is the reward. At level 1, all your stats are 10, which really ain't too great, and it's especially problematic when you consider the stat requirements of desirable weapons, because 10 points across the board just don't cut it if you want the good gear. Sure, you can always two-hand a weapon to get a boost in strength, but for dex deficiencies, that ain't going to work, same with intelligence and faith and the like. Radagon's Scar Seal, however, raises your Vigour, Endurance, Strength and Dexterity by 3 points each, whereas Margit's Scar Seal does the same but for Mind, Intelligence, Faith and Arcane, though the Sword Seal talismans go even further, raising those stats by 5 points each, which, as you'd imagine, is super useful for a level 1 run. Equipping a Sword Seal is essentially like getting 23 levels while technically staying at level 1. Now, the catch is that equipping these talismans lowers your damage negation, making you more fragile, but the counter to the catch is that who gives a shit? This is a level 1 run where your HP is very low anyway, and so after a certain point into the run, most boss attacks will one-shot KO you regardless of what talismans you have equipped, so hey, might as well rock a Sword Seal or two anyway. With my fancy new talisman, I decided I was a bit bored with my plain old Lord Swan straight sword, and so decided to wield the Morning Star, with the Scar Seal giving me the extra strength points I needed to wield it one-handed. And as you'll see, I ended up using the Morning Star for most of this playthrough. It's a fairly plain weapon, but that makes it somewhat versatile, and best of all, it does inherent bleed damage, meaning that even if you imbue it with the cold affinity so that it does frost build up, its bleed capabilities will remain, albeit to a somewhat weakened degree. With my preparation and various miscellaneous wanderings concluded, 'twas time to journey— I don't know why I'm talking like this. It was time to journey northward to Liurnia, straight to the Academy of Rhea Lucaria, in fact, no fanning around here. Compared to traversing through Stormhill Castle, my time at the Academy was marginally less painful, though still quite painful, what with all the glintstone projectiles flying every which way and all, and for some reason I found myself getting repeatedly wrecked by the Onyx Lord of all enemies. Totally optional fight of course, and not even a boss, but I just wanted to take him down for fun anyway. Except after the bastard did this to me, my motivations towards his downfall shifted from casual fun to full-blown vengeance, and indeed, on my next attempt, Candle-type level 1A prevailed. Oh, well, maybe it was the next attempt then. Okay, the one after this. There we go, easy. But we're not here to talk about the Onyx Lord. No. We are here to discuss the Red Wolf of Radagon, who must be put down before you can move onwards to Rennala. Folks, even before attempting this fight, I was not a big fan of the boss. I love the way it looks, even if it is rather derivative of Great Grey Wolf Sith, but I've never much enjoyed the actual fight part of it, whether it's against this canine in particular or the lesser red wolves roaming around elsewhere in the world. Even so, never really foresaw this encounter as one which would give me too much trouble. See, for me the Red Wolf of Radagon is one of those messy Elden Ring bosses, in the sense that my bouts with it are never clean. I always feel dirty afterwards, because I inevitably get beat to hell in the melee and end up having to use all my damn Crimson Flasks. I feel much the same way about the Rune Bears. Messy. Here's the problem though. You cannot allow things to get very messy at all on a level 1 run. That's not to say it has to be done hitless, because you can survive some of the wolf's attacks even with such low HP and Radagon's Scar Seal equipped, but some of its moves will kill you outright if you make a mistake, especially its magic attacks. No one likes a bloody boss that just won't sit still. Bad dog! The Red Wolf loves to hop and dash around the arena and throw out irritating magic attacks while doing it. This isn't one of those fights where there's a consistent exchange of blows, where there's constant danger but also constant opportunities for damage. It's a fight where you wait for the boss to get close, let off an attack or two, and then have to wait for it to piss off and do its business of jumping and flipping round, letting off its damnable sorcery before it eventually comes back to you so you can let off another couple of attacks, and that sorcery element really isn't any fun. Those trios of delayed glintstone projectiles are irritating to deal with on their own, but sometimes while you are in the process of dodging them, the boss will come at you with another attack, making it seemingly impossible to deal with one without getting hit by the other. This wasn't even that rare a thing, to the extent that any time it used this move, which was often, I got nervous that it would be followed up with something that I could not realistically also avoid. Even the Red Wolf's melee attacks were problematic for me due to how suddenly they come out. Again, same issue as I have with Rune Bears and the Golden Hippopotamus enemy from the DLC. These are enemies that feel difficult to me in a way that I just don't enjoy. Up until this point in the run, even though I'd certainly died many times to both regular enemies and bosses, I was still having quite a lot of fun. But the Red Wolf of Radagon is where the fun train was temporarily ground to a halt, and not for the last time throughout this run, trust me. On any sort of challenging boss in a game like this, the most important thing is that you are making forward progress. Dying is fine, spending hours on a boss is a-okay with me, as long as you are getting better whilst doing it. This is one of the main differences between a hard boss and a painful boss, and let me tell you, the Red Wolf of Radagon was surely one of the latter. Died a bloody ton to it, and even after an hour and a half of attempts, I still found myself sometimes getting nailed really quickly after passing through the fog gate, which was very aggravating. But, of course, I did eventually come out on top. Wasn't a super clean attempt, I hadn't achieved anything close to mastery of the boss's moveset, but I did beat it, and I felt pretty damn good that I never had to beat it again. I give the Red Wolf of Radagon an 8 on the pain scale and a dismal 2 for pleasure. Not a great boss at the best of times, but truly an obnoxious and tiresome affair when fought at level 1. The fact of the matter is, however, that even though it is mandatory if you want to progress onward to the magical heights of the Academy, the Red Wolf of Radagon is just a minor boss, with the bizarrely proportioned Queen of the Full Moon, Rennala, lying a bit further ahead, just a bit past Moongrum. Moongrum stinks and I don't like him. Rennala is an interesting boss difficulty wise. I mean, with Godrick, most players who reach him are probably going to have fairly similar experiences as far as difficulty is concerned. I mean, sure, you can spend a ton of time scouring Limgrave for all its secrets, clear the Weeping Peninsula, and even travel onward to Liurnia and beyond, all before setting a tarnished foot inside Stormhill Castle. But I imagine most players probably take him on when they're around level 30, with a weapon that's maybe around +3 or +4. With Rennala though, there is a far wider range of potential difficulty depending on what you do before getting to her. Yes, you could just make your way straight to the Academy after making it to Liurnia. There's even a portal that warps you straight to the front gate at Laskiar Ruins, but if you take the time to really explore Liurnia beforehand, which is absolutely massive of course, then you can easily find yourself making mincemeat of Rennala by the time you get there due to how over-leveled and over-equipped you are. On my very first playthrough of Elden Ring, I found Rennala quite difficult because I bypassed most of the region before getting there, whereas on my second playthrough, she posed no challenge at all, because I was far more diligent in exploring the region. Well, despite Rennala not exactly being seen as one of the game's more difficult encounters, she gave me a lot of trouble here. First phase is super straightforward and simple, but this does have the side effect of making the whole affair more tedious than it needs to be, due to how you have to go through the whole rigmarole every time you die in phase 2. Not to mention the irritating fact that there are no stakes of Margit in the Academy, making the run back a bit shittier than I'd really like it to be. The thing that makes phase 2 hard here is mostly as simple as her magic attacks really sting. On a regular run, you can tank them to some extent, but short of something simply clipping you, most of her moves will kill you outright on a level 1 run. Her magic isn't all that difficult to avoid, but I'll time a roll or start sprinting away a bit too slowly when she casts Glintstone Stars and you are fried, sir. Now back you go up that damn elevator and through phase 1 yet again. Don't want to pretend like Rennala felt brutal or unfair because she didn't. For one, she doesn't have all that much HP, she's not difficult to stagger, and her animations are very easily interrupted. Things do get far busier and harder to manage when she starts summoning in help though, be it a pack of wolves, a bloodhound knight, a troll or a dragon, and depending on which, you can find yourself spending most of your time having to flee away from the summoned entity, rather than being able to deal any damage to Rennala. Got to be honest, I had so much trouble with this boss that I deemed it prudent to take a break from her and do some other things. I went away and upgraded my Morning Star a bit more, ascended up the ruin-strewn precipice, and I fought a couple of minor bosses for fun before returning to the academy for the decisive battle. And even when I did beat her, I got a bit lucky. Got a couple of good staggers on her, a nice bleed, and while she did manage to get a summon off, it was just a pack of wolves, so very easily managed. Even so, look, it still counts, and I was chuffed enough that I'd taken down yet another Remembrance boss. Now only 13 more to go. Not to mention all the mandatory non-Remembrance bosses that need to be taken out too. Hey, no one said this was supposed to be easy. For my pain, Rennala gets a rating of 6, and for pleasure, 6 again. With Rennala down, numerous opportunities had presented themselves to me. While I could have travelled eastward into the Caelid Wilds or below ground into the subterranean regions, my eyes were fixed firmly treeward towards Altus Plateau, with my chosen path there being via the ruin-strewn precipice. This did mean having to take out Magma Worm Makar, but this wasn't as hard as I feared it might be, particularly because by this point I went with the cold affinity for my Morning Star, allowing for some very helpful damage bursts from frost buildup, not to mention the 20% increase in damage the enemies take when frozen. Feels good, bro. Now that I'd made it to the home region of the Erdtree, had a bit of fun roaming around and fighting a couple of bosses. The one place I was very keen on getting to was Lux's Ruins, where demi-human Queen Gillica resided. Even on a level 1 run, piss easy boss, especially with me making use of the Wild Swing's Ash of War. Another very basic skill, but if you're fighting the kind of enemy where there are opportunities to wail on them for several seconds at a time through staggers or through long easily avoided attack animations, Wild Swings is very effective at dealing damage and building up bleed and frost. Real reason I came to Lux's Ruins though was to pick up the Ritual Sword Talisman, providing a 10% damage buff when at full health. Great talisman on any run, but particularly so on a level 1 run due to the fact that I'm basically at full health at all times anyway. When your health and defense is this low, from the second half of the playthrough onwards, incoming damage mostly ceases to be a thing. There's mostly just incoming death. That being said, there is an important exception. Observe that by this point I'd now started making more effective use of the Wondrous Flask, with the Opaline Bubble tier being the star of the show. When in effect, you can tank pretty much any hit and take only minor damage, once. Needless to say, the Opaline Bubble tier goes a long way towards making level 1 runs actually feel viable for the common man or woman. Without it, for the later bosses you'd literally need to beat everything hitless, whereas with this in action, you've essentially got an extra life, and indeed I both used and cherished it for every remaining boss in this run. God bless the Opaline Bubble tier. After I'd gotten my affairs thoroughly in order throughout Altus Plateau, it was time to head into the royal capital, and if you're wanting to get in from the side entrance, like I was, that means going up against the Draconic Tree Sentinel. The regular old Tree Sentinel is an intimidating enemy, big, mounted, heavy armour, heavy weapon and slow, weighty attacks, designed to get you pressured and panicking. The Draconic variety really dials everything up a notch or two though. Gnarlier armour, bigger weapons, spikier shield, their bloody horses breathe fire, and they get a frankly terrifying red lightning buff in phase 2, upping their damage, expanding their moveset, and widening the general area of effect of most of their attacks. All that said, I do love and have always loved this enemy. Difficult as hell, but really fun too. There's such a feeling of tension from even being close to it, because even if you're on a regular playthrough, you know that if you get caught out by that hammer, you're most likely going down. This attack in particular always makes me absolutely shit myself. I died a few times to the Draconic tree Sentinel here, but those were really just warm-ups, okay? It was all part of the plan. I give the Draconic tree Sentinel a 3 on the pain scale and a 7.5 on the pleasure scale. Great enemy and very tough, though the less said about the one in crumbling for Amazula, the better. Leyndell, eh? Yahoo! We're here. There's a massive spear, get used to it. I died a lot in Leyndell. Like I said, nice thing about a level 1 run is that the optimal strategy for the levels is to just run straight past shit, but sometimes that's far easier said than done. Got caught out plenty of times by Oracle Envoys and Leyndell Knights and the Erdtree Avatar, etc, but it was all in good fun, especially because I knew there was a certain other talisman of interest here waiting to be picked up just outside the Colosseum. The Ritual Shield Talisman, providing a 30% defense buff when at full health, which does you a lot of favours in a run like this, as you can imagine. I'd have this equipped for a few bosses from this point on, so that I'd have at least some chance of surviving an attack here or there, even without my Opaline bubble tier used up. Though after a while, almost any attack started killing me in one anyway, not just due to the low health and lack of armour, but also because of the defense debuff from Radagon's Sword Seal, which by this point I had picked up from Fort Faroth in Caelid. Now though, boss time. It's Golden Godfrey. Godfrey here is pretty much the same sort of boss as the Red Wolf of Radagon, in the sense that he lies a bit before the main boss and Runebearer of the level. Mind you, aside from that, there's basically no similarity, with the main difference being that I don't detest Golden Godfrey. There's really not all that much to say about this boss, to be honest. He's just a far easier version of the true Elden Lord, with a smaller moveset, no phase 2 and far less charm. I know I made a comparison to the Red Wolf of Radagon, but a more apt comparison would be to Godrick the Grafted. I happen to love the actual Godfrey fight at the end of the game and know his moveset extremely well, and so even though I admittedly did perish a couple times here, the fight wasn't difficult at all, and hey, I got another talisman slot for my troubles. I give Golden Godfrey a 2 on the pain scale and a 6 on the pleasure scale. Not an interesting or remarkable boss in its own right, but still enjoyable enough. So you might expect me to start mouthing off about Morgott now due to the fact that he's just beyond the Erdtree Sanctuary where Godfrey's spirit is fought, but I just pleased myself throughout this run and fought whoever the hell I felt like fighting at the time, in any old order. And so instead of me going straight in on the Omen King, I said, you know what, let's visit Caelid first. Let's nail Radahn. I assumed I would need to fanny around with Blythe and Ranni's questline beforehand so that the festival could begin in Castle Redmane, but when I got there I was pleasantly reminded that ascending to Altus Plateau also triggers the festival, so I didn't have to do the whole back and forth rigmarole with Blythe, Ranni and Sylvis, which was nice, because I couldn't be f***ing bothered doing all that. That said, still had to do a bit of the Ranni stuff later on, so as to be able to access Astel, but whoa there partner, we ain't there yet. Really didn't waste too much time roaming the rotting red wastes of Caelid, I just went straight to Castle Redmane, feeling marginally confident with my plus 13 Cold Morning Star and fine selection of talismans, marginally confident. I have of course beaten Radahn before at level 1, as I have every Remembrance boss except for Malenia, but the major difference was that I made liberal use of the many summonable phantoms back then. In fact, I damn well relied on them to take some of Radahn's considerable heat off of me. He is a terrifying boss at the best of times, but multiply that terror several fold when you're at level 1. No phantoms this time though, no. This time I had to rely solely on my wits for a chance at victory. This time there would be no hiding behind Alexander or Blythe or Great Horned Tragoth. This time, Candle type level 1A was on his own, and I struggled. I'll tell you what though, I'll tell you what. By far the biggest area of agony for me in this battle was not the close quarters action, but rather the damn trek up to Radahn from where you start near the shoreline. I've really never liked having to dodge Radahn's arrows every time you start this fight. It's one of those things that's really cool in theory, but in practice, and when it's placed at the beginning of such a difficult boss, it quickly becomes even more of a chore than Rennala's whole phase 1 shtick, except far more dangerous. No exaggeration here, at least half my deaths with this boss occurred before I even reached him. I got pretty good at dodging his single spear arrows, but I still don't really know how to reliably avoid his scatter shot ones. I mean, you could quickly get off torrent while he's firing them so as to dodge through them, but the issue is that he always lets them off after his arrow rain attack, which you can't avoid with a roll. Got to full speed gallop away until this bastard of an attack has run its bothersome course. There is one odd strat I tried here, where at the very start of the fight you about turn and run back towards the shore, messing with Radahn's tracking and making him prematurely end his ranged mode of attacking. But although this did work a couple of times for me, it was too inconsistent, and sometimes he'd just carry on ass blasting me with arrows as I rode closer to him, and I wasn't having much fun with this aspect of the fight. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I was some pro when I did manage to get right up in his grill, because I performed poorly in that regard also, but where I just wanted to get right back into the action after every death, nope, had to go through the arrows first and probably die while doing it. Thankfully, towards the end, I did manage to find a fairly consistent way of coming out unscathed from his ranged business by heading to the left and strafing round Radahn while he fired out his scatter shots, then going in for the kill. And by kill I mean getting killed by the boss, usually. Even though I'm certainly no stranger to Radahn's moveset by this point, he's one of those bosses I've never gotten all that good at, and for as big a fan favourite as he is, I've never loved this fight. It's good, but I don't love it, maybe because I'm not all that good at it. Even so, every dog has its day, and I did eventually topple Caelid's rotting giant, though it was far from any sort of honourable or flawless victory. Relied heavily on jump attacks for their damage and posture build-up, and I made effective use of wild swings during those gravity attacks he does after losing some HP in phase 1, building up plenty of bleed and frost. For as formidable a foe as Radahn is in his first phase, his second phase scares me shitless. So many expansive attacks with accompanying gravity blasts and airborne twirls and flying boulders. Fortunately, did so much damage before he lifted off that the deal was pretty much sealed by the time he fell back down to earth. My balls were in my throat throughout this whole battle, because I wanted this to be the winning one so badly, and when that final blow was struck, it was a load off my mind. Radahn is far from being the hardest boss in this run, but he's still a tough customer. I give Radahn a 7 on the pain meter, mainly thanks to his introductory arrow attacks, and a 4 on the pleasure scale. Didn't hate this encounter, but didn't enjoy it all that much either, was mainly just glad that it was over. After the moderate degree of trauma that Radahn caused me before hopping back over to Leyndell, I decided to go through some of Ranni's stuff, up to bringing her back the Fingerslayer blade from Nokron. Also, I can get a wee bit closer to being able to access Astel just a bit later on. Before being allowed an audience with the Lunar Princess though, I had to take out Royal Knight Loretta within the Royal Moongazing grounds. Thankfully, this is one of those encounters that I don't have all that much to say about, because it was piss easy. Loretta has never been a tough opponent for me on any run, and I can always beat her second or even first try like I did here. Thanks to the Ritual Shield Talisman, I was able to survive most of her attacks, and even though she's immune to both bleed and frost, it doesn't matter because she doesn't have all that much health to get through. I cannot give Royal Knight Loretta anything other than a 1 on the pain scale, and a 5.5 for pleasure. It's an okay fight, but mostly just one to be breezed through so as to get to Ranni. While I'm here though, let me tell you that the second time I will take on Loretta over at the Haligtree, things will go very, very differently, so stay tuned for that. With a good chunk of Ranni's questline taken care of, I thought this made for a splendid time to finally face off against Morgott at the foot of the Erdtree. Morgott used to be one of my favourite bosses in the game. Was really blown away by every aspect of this encounter on my first playthrough, and no wonder. Awesome, interesting and tragic character, and I consider his curved greatsword to be one of FromSoft's all-time coolest weapons, especially the sick way it's revealed as its stony casing crumbles away to reveal the arcane blade within. Love Morgott's Phase 2 transition dialogue as well. I find it all to be very emotional and intense, and his moveset is far more complex here than Margit's was back at Stormvale. However, on my last level 1 run, my opinion of Margit actually underwent something of an unfavourable shift. All those crazy complex combos of his suddenly became way more problematic for me to deal with, whereas they weren't much of a problem on regular runs. This is because most of his individual attacks really don't do all that much damage, especially if you're buff as hell from exploring Altus Plateau and Leyndell, and I've even heard a bunch of people complain that Morgott is too easy for where he's placed in the game. I sure as shit did not find him to be too easy at level 1 though. I had a brutal time dealing with his more lengthy and erratic attack strings, and all of a sudden, for as great and emotional a spectacle as this battle can be, I really wasn't having much fun with this, relying heavily on whatever Spirit Ash I was using at the time. This time round though, and I don't know why, but things went considerably smoother. Not saying I beat Morgott first try, I actually beat him on my 10th try, but I did find myself to be fairly adept at dealing with his offense, and my damage output was more than capable of making relatively short work of his 10,000 or so HP, though once again the bleed and frost played an important part in all this, aided as ever by the wild swings Ash of War. For as rough as I expected this fight to possibly get when I made my approach towards the Erdtree, I was pleasantly surprised at how it did go. The difficulty was actually perfectly manageable, the kind that you know you'll overcome after a half hour or so. I give Morgott just a 3.5 on the pain scale and a 6.5 on the pleasure scale. After this victory, I was damn happy with the momentum that the run had taken on, things were looking up. But it was time for the Valiant Gargoyles. An annoying thing about the Valiant Gargoyles, even aside from the actual battle, is that I nearly didn't have to fight them at all. Although I did take on quite a few mini and minor bosses throughout this run, this was often just for fun, or for a particular talisman which I knew would be helpful, but the only bosses I needed to beat were the Remembrance ones, and by extension, any non-Remembrance boss which had to be beaten in order to get to a Remembrance boss, like the aforementioned Red Wolf of Radagon and Golden Godfrey, and yes, the Valiant Gargoyles, who must be defeated to gain access to Deeproot Depths where Fortissax can be found. Or so I always thought. Found out afterwards that apparently you can also get there via the subterranean shunning grounds or something, I guess meaning that I didn't actually need to fight this boss after all, but I did fight the boss, and it sucked. Honestly though, for as rough as the Valiant Gargoyles are, I don't think they're the worst double fight in the game. Although it's pretty far in, it's not endgame level difficulty, meaning that if you're struggling there's plenty of scope to just leave and come back later when you're more powerful, which is not something you can really do with the Godskin Duo, who are found much closer to the end of the game. Of course, I did not have the privilege of being able to leave this fight and come back when I was more leveled up, but I could still come back with a more upgraded weapon, which is exactly what I ended up doing. Right from the get-go, I knew this fight was going to be a certified stinker, and yeah, it was. I died a bunch of times even before the second gargoyle would show up, and when it did come crashing down from above, I'd usually get obliterated by a twirl of its twin blade, or from that godforsaken poison breath attack. Also known as one of the worst attacks in the game. Seriously, why does this attack have to suck this much? When I first tried my hand at taking on the Gargs, my Morning Star was plus 14, but after getting pounded and pounded, I went off to fight through a few other bosses and came back later when it was plus 19. Now that's more like it. Sadly, for as reinforced as my weapon may have been, a real bummer about these two monstrosities is that they are completely immune to both bleed and frost, which really sucks, because I needed all the help I could get. Furthermore, no summons for me, had to do this all on my own, which really was dreadful. This is one of those level 1 fights where I wasn't 100% sure I was even good enough to beat it. It really was that rough. Turns out though that I was a bit better than I thought I was, because after however many attempts, I did beat the Valiant Gargoyles at level 1, without any summons and even without a great rune equipped, and I damn well deserved it too. On my winning attempt, I was on top of my game with the dodges and smart with my punishes, and when the finishing blow was finally struck, I roared with triumph at the sheer bloody catharsis of it. I'm going to give the Valiant Gargoyles a 7.5 on the pain scale, but this is a case where my pleasure levels were not inverse to the pain I felt, because I'm giving this boss a 7 on the pleasure scale. I know, this boss sucks, but that final winning battle felt so damn good that it would be a crime to shortchange it, so there you go. Instead of going straight down the coffin into Deeproot depths, I took some time to take care of a bit of busy work first, including taking out more Erdtree avatars, discovering an interaction with Alexander in Liurnia that I had no idea even existed, and most importantly I finished up Ranni's quest so that I could gain access to Ainzel River, Noxtella, the Lake of Rot, and ultimately Astel, Naturalborn of the Void. Astel was another boss that had left quite an impression on me after my last level 1 run, and a positive one too. This is never a boss I'd struggled much with on regular playthroughs, but taking it on at such a low level was a different story altogether, even with me having used Spirit Ashes back then. Astel isn't an entity you can just run up and constantly hit while deftly dodging its moves, because about half of its moves are there to make you leave its immediate vicinity, like its AoE gravity attack, or most dangerously of all, its outward radiating ground shockwaves. As such, spacing is of the utmost importance here. Astel's kind of like a dragon battle in that sense, especially considering how mobile it can be, not from flying around or breathing fire, but from its ability to teleport around the arena and from its gravity laser. On my last level 1 run, Astel very quickly seemed like a near insurmountable monster, because rather than me being able to tank the odd hit here or there, I had to get good enough to avoid everything, and that turned out to take a hell of a lot of practice. Through this process, however, Astel went from being a nightmare to fight, one of those encounters that's difficult in the painful sense, to one that increasingly felt very rewarding as I figured out the proper spacing and timings. And I ended the whole thing with a whole new appreciation for this bizarre boss that I'd never before had the opportunity to truly learn. That run had been a while ago though, and so I was a wee bit out of practice, and whilst it would have been nice if I'd have been able to just slip right back into the old routine, this malformed star was just a bit too bright for me to handle right off the bat. One aspect of the boss that I knew well, however, was that the safest place to be was generally a few meters in front of it, as opposed to being right up in front of its face or body. Of course, as you've seen, I hadn't meddled with magic or incantations at all in this run, and nor would I at any point beyond this, but there was another intriguing option: crossbows. Here's the lovely thing about crossbows, it's that they do not scale with any stat, and the reason this is so lovely is that my stats were shit anyway, so bring it on. Farmed the Godrick soldiers near the Gatefront ruins in Limgrave for the heavy crossbow because of its minimal stat requirements, reinforced that baby up to plus 12 and bought a whole bunch of bolts before once more descending to Astel's lair, and this is the kind of thing I love about runs like this. I have never used a crossbow before in this game, just never been interested in them, because if I am in the mood for some ranged fun, I'll probably go with a bow. For a level 1 run though, it quickly stops being about what you want to use, but rather what you have to use to scrape a victory, and sometimes that means using things you've always disregarded. I've never been too bothered about which elements bosses were weak against, but in this run, there were a few bosses where I sure as hell had to exploit those sort of weaknesses, as were there some Ashes of War and weapon affinities that I'd never thought to use before in normal runs, but where, here, I found to be invaluable, and all these elements made for an incredibly rewarding gaming experience. Back to the crossbow though, it worked like a charm. In fact, I nailed Astel on my first try after coming back with the heavy crossbow. It did perfectly respectable damage, was easy to use, Astel's forward attacks were really easy for me to dodge, and I was still able to dive in to hit its head weak point every now and then for the odd punish. His meteor attacks still concerned the hell out of me, but I remembered some comment on one of my older videos where someone recommended simply running forward and left when he launched it, and turns out this completely works, so all good there. I give Astel a 4.5 on the pain scale because he did make me go off and have to try a different strategy, but I'll also give it a 7 for pleasure because I like that. Felt great when the crossbow strategy ended up working so well and it made for a great battle, hell yeah. With Astel beaten, I no longer had to mess around anymore with the Ranni questline, though I did take a trip over to Morgott's Divine Tower so I could activate his Great Rune. I'd already done this for Godrick's Great Rune of course, which is incredible for level 1 runs, basically providing you with 40 free stat points until you die, but whereas that rune gives you a health boost via the 5 extra points to your Vigour stat, the health boost from Morgott's rune is way more potent. Tell you what though, remember that barely memorable boss fight on the way there against the Fell Twins? Yeah, this fight turned out to be really tough here. Took me way more attempts than I expected it to, though just as with the Valiant Gargoyle fight, I was really chuffed with my eventual win. Played like a goddamn champ and only took a couple of hits, and now on to my reward. Here's the shiter though, that I didn't realise. Turns out the Morgott's Great Rune health boost is entirely percentage based. Oh sure, it's a big percentage, 25%, but here's what that increase looks like when your health is low to begin with. Suffice to say, I went back to Godrick's Great Rune after this. I decided it was high time to head down to Deeproot Depths. After a quick tussle with the level's Erdtree avatar, I jaunted merrily onwards to Godwyn's corpse, whistling as I went, of course, before being able to enter into Fia's dream to battle Fortissax. Got to take on Fia's champions first, but pfft, you know what, who gives a turkey? I don't give a care, because this barely even is a boss to begin with. Certainly not something to get all that worried about. Dude, would you believe me if I told you that this ended up being one of the hardest bosses in this whole playthrough? Because I couldn't believe it. These enemies who you fight may just be NPC types rather than big intimidating monsters or demigods, but that makes them faster, less predictable, and just as, if not more, powerful. It was uniquely aggravating the way they could just throw out a basic attack and wipe out my health bar with a twin blade, rapier or axe, and the magic attacks made the whole affair extra tedious, particularly the glint blade phalanx favoured by Rogier and rancor call as thrown out by Lionel the Lionhearted, an attack where the only thing you can realistically do is run away until the skulls disappear. Banged my head against the wall for a while with Fia's champions and really wasn't getting anywhere. Trouble was that it's excessively dangerous to even be anywhere near these phantoms. Had to pick my attacks super wisely or I was just dead. Had to play perfectly. This was another boss where, after a while, I decided it would be better to leave and come back later, so as to spare my sanity from further deterioration, and so I did some stuff in the mountaintops of the Giants, even visited Castle Sol. More on that soon. After a while, and with a slightly more reinforced Morning Star, I returned to Deeproot Depths for another go at it, but still found it to be too hard, basically. Except this time, I had a secret technique up my sleeve. Flaming Strike. Not only had I never used this Ash of War before, but I don't think I'd ever even tried out the flame or flame art affinities on any weapon. The numbers sure were looking nice though, and I thought it would make for a fun experiment to try it out, and I also equipped the Flame Shrouding Cracked Tear in my Wondrous Flask to temporarily boost all fire damage, making Flaming Strike a fiery force to be reckoned with. Did great damage, could launch it while standing a little distance from the enemies, and it could hit multiple enemies at a time, and it also imbued my Morning Star with a fire buff for 40 seconds if I did the follow-up heavy attack. I won't lie and say that Fia's champions became trivial after I started using Flaming Strike, because I still died many more times, but it definitely was key to my victory. I give Fia's champions an almighty 8.5 on the pain scale and a pathetic 1.5 for pleasure. This fight was really difficult in a way which was neither fun nor interesting, and I piss on it. Remember I said I took a wee trip to Castle Sol to calm myself down after getting roasted by Fia's champions one too many times? Well, that ended up bringing its own problems, and those problems were Commander Niall and his pair of banished flunkies. I had earlier picked up half of the Haligtree secret medallion from poor old Albus in the village of the Albinaurics, but that's the easy half. The other half of the medallion is located at the top of Castle Sol, past Commander Niall. I've always found this boss to be quite a difficult one, but a pretty damn cool one too, even if he is a reskin of Commander O'Neill. It's not even just the boss that's difficult. Castle Sol in general is a dangerous and frankly not very fun level to play through, with its most dangerous enemy being the Banished Knights, aka one of the most frustratingly difficult enemies in the game, thanks to their devastating combos, range and frosty AoE attacks. Which also happens to be one of the things that makes this boss such an ordeal, because there happens to be 2 of these knights thrown into the mix here, and I don't like it. I earlier complained that the frustration of the Radahn fight stemmed from how many of my deaths occurred before I even got close to the boss, and it's a similar sort of situation here, because at least half my deaths were not even at the hands of the good commander, but by his knights. These guys really are a nightmare, especially with there being 2 of them, and with about 2000 HP apiece, they do not go down quickly either. Now, although I'm sure this fight wasn't a walk in the park in my last level 1 run, I didn't really have any memories of it being one of the harder fights in that playthrough, though of course, a big reason for that would have been that I was using Spirit Ashes there, going some way towards balancing things out in this otherwise 3-on-1 shit show. No such privileges this time though, and it quickly became apparent that this was going to be a problem. There's been 2 or 3 bosses discussed thus far where I felt it was wise to leave and come back later, but that was really the case for Commander Niall. In fact, when I did come back here later, I once again made the decision to leave and come back later still after several other bosses had been cleared. As you can imagine, all this was really annoying and painful because a lot of the difficulty was of the bullshit variety. I was barely dying to the boss at all. I was dying to the 2 brutal enemies thrown in, and whenever I did manage to clear them, I usually end up very quickly dying to the boss himself thanks to the fact that any of his moves were a one-shot KO, and this is a boss where just being near to him is very dangerous thanks to his massive blizzard attacks. However, perseverance really did end up paying off for me, and just as Flaming Strike worked a treat for Fia's champions, the same was true here, with the Flame Shrouding Cracked Tear, Fire Scorpion Talisman, Flame Art Morning Star and Flaming Strike and its follow-up heavy attack and associated fire buff, I managed to work out an effective and consistent strategy for dealing with the 2 Banished Knights, who took massive damage from it. It was still dangerous, but it did work, and that just left Commander Niall. This was another opponent who at first seemed like this immovable, nigh unbeatable entity of difficulty, this solid wall of ice standing between me and the Haligtree medallion, but really, as redundant and unimaginative as it may be for me to say, the trick ultimately turned out to be just learn his attacks. It was a long grind and I died countless times, but eventually I had all his attacks worked out. I knew when the ice AoEs would come, I figured out when to stay near him and when to run the hell away, and I stopped becoming so intimidated and flustered when I saw him gearing up for one of his lightning kicks. In fact, when I eventually beat him after God knows how many attempts, I did it without taking a single bloody hit. This was one of only 2 hitless victories in the entire playthrough, and it simply came via attrition, from observation, experimentation, and then application across the nation. I'm going to give Commander Niall a 7 on the pain scale. He was really difficult for me, but in saying that, the pain was front-loaded and subsided gradually from the beginning of my attempts to the end, where it all started to feel more logical and manageable, and so I'm going to hand out an 8 for pleasure. Seriously, I ended up having a lot of fun with Commander Niall by the end, to the extent that I was actually a wee bit sad when I managed to beat him, because the show was now over. Still not a fan of the 2 Banished Knights, but at the same time I did figure out a decent way to take them down, so it is what it is. And now, on to Fortissax. Fortissax is one of those bosses where right from the start of the run you know he's going to be a big problemo. He's certainly not one of the hardest bosses in the game, generally speaking, because it's really easy to leave until the end when you can take him down without too much of an issue. When you can tank lots of hits and keep on trucking, and where his near 13,000 HP just isn't all that intimidating. On level 1 though, oh boy, things are very different. When discussing the Red Wolf of Radagon, I refer to it as a messy fight, in the sense that I will inevitably take more hits than I like to when fighting it. Fortissax is also a very messy boy, but to a bit of a different degree and in a different way. The mess here pertains to his red lightning, cause it's bloody everywhere. About half of his attacks cause red lightning after trails and ground waves. His signature lightning spear attack has an enormous sweeping area of effect that is very intimidating to dodge when you know that it will kill you if it connects. And worst of all, there's that troublesome main feature of the fight where sprites of lightning regularly attach themselves to you before detonating after a few seconds, meaning you must be extra observant not only of what the boss is doing, but also whether or not your character is going to erupt in a blast of red lightning in the next couple of seconds. The boss might give you a great opening for you to dive in and start striking, but if that lightning stuck to you, then you've got to cut the punishment short and get sprinting, or execute a timely dodge roll if you are confident enough. Not only that though, but Deathblight is a real issue here in a way that it's normally not, and that's because of the lack of armour. As well as increasing physical and elemental resistance, armour also increases status effect resistance, including vitality, which governs resistance to Deathblight, and so when you're not wearing any armour, that Deathblight meter fills up alarmingly quickly. I guess I could have gotten a hold of the Prince of Death's Pustule Talisman to increase my vitality, but that would take up one of my precious talisman slots, and also I just couldn't be bothered getting it, is the real answer. Whilst fire served me very well in the last two boss fights, I switched back to frost for Fortissax and equipped the chilling mist Ash of War, allowing me to send out cold clouds to build up frostbite, though to be honest, this skill was kind of redundant, because it wasn't very difficult to simply build up frost by attacking anyway. Even with the power of frost, Fortissax was a proper problem for me due to the fire, lightning and deathblight hazards, and so after a while I decided to be a bit more unconventional, going as far as to try throwing out poison knives at the start of each fight. This experiment ended up being crap and worthless, and so I stopped, but that shows you my desperation to achieve as much damage as I possibly could. In the end, however, it was not poison knives or some crafty Ash of War that nailed me my victory, but rather Godrick's Great Rune. As you'd expect, almost anything from Fortissax is a one-hit KO, but after dying one too many times, I decided to use one of my precious rune arcs, and seriously, it made all the difference. The damage and stamina boosts and whatnot were great, but the extra survivability was a literal lifesaver, and although I'm sure I would have beaten Fortissax eventually without a Great Rune activated, it was absolutely the deciding factor in this winning attempt. Long fight too, a full 5 minutes of constant tension, and a fight I was very much glad to have beaten. I give Fortissax an 8 on the pain scale and a 5.5 on the pleasure scale. Very tough fight that was supremely difficult at level 1. I wouldn't go as far as to say it had bullshit difficulty, but it was a busy, messy and stressful affair, and it was certainly one of the harder fights of the run. Could have headed forward to the peak of the mountaintops of the giants at this point to fight you-know-who, but seemed like a fine time to pay a visit to Mount Gelmir for an audience with Praetor Rykard. My relationship with Rykard is one which has undulated, much like the form of his serpentine body. On normal runs, I've always considered him to be moderately difficult, though the intended strategy of using the Serpent Hunter Spear certainly does lower his threat level and adds a bit of gimmick to the battle, in a good way. It's a great boss. And so on my last level 1 run, I remember going in not expecting much of a tough time, because whether you're level 1 or level 100, the strategy for victory is the same. Hit him with the freaking spear. For whatever reason though, Rykard took me several hours to defeat back then. Had a really hard time dealing with the god-devouring serpent and an even harder time with phase 2. Damage wasn't really the issue, especially because you both can and should reinforce the Serpent Hunter for this fight. It's fine at base level, but way more effective at +7 or +8 if you've got the resources for it. But I guess I was just really shit at dodging all of Rykard's big scary attacks back then, plus Spirit Ashes are almost useless for this fight. Well, based on how much of a challenge he was back then, I stepped into Rykard's lair, this time expecting another few hours of desperation before an eventual hard-fought victory. However, what actually ended up happening was that I got extremely close to beating him on my first attempt before completely beating him on my second, where I took only a single hit to break my Opaline bubble tier protection, and then another minor lick of damage from the lava around Rykard's body. Christ knows what the hell was wrong with me before when I had such a hard time with Rykard, but yeah, completely nailed him this time round. Though smart and timely use of the Serpent Hunter's Ash of War was very important for victory, so as to interrupt his more dangerous attack animations, particularly the whole Screaming Skull phase which ends in Taker's Flame, which I did not want to have to deal with. Even though I can't quite believe I'm saying it, I give Rykard a feeble 1.5 on the pain scale, because I only died once, and I'll hand out a modest 6 for my pleasure rating. Conditions were certainly hot, heavy and stifling down in Rykard's hellish lair beneath the earth, but if you think things are going to calm down from here on, guess again. In fact, that's the easy shit out of the way, because ahead of us now lies only the big boys and the big girls, starting out with a really big boy, the Fire Giant. I like the Fire Giant. I know a lot of people don't, but I actually think it's one of FromSoft's coolest ever bosses. Not one of the best, but coolest. I love how huge it is and how the game really makes you feel this with the weight and scale of its attacks and firestorms, and the way it rolls around this expansive arena, all right in view of the Crucible of the Giants. It can be a really hard fight though, particularly the second phase which, while still being very visually impressive, I do not find as enjoyable as the first, not least of all because of how difficult it becomes to deal decent damage, and because of the increased danger from the Giants' ranged attacks. Let me tell you though, right? Are you listening? The Fire Giant on my last level 1 run 2 years ago was probably the second hardest boss of that entire playthrough. This boss must have taken me about 8 hours to beat, and I ain't exaggerating one bit. Even though I was wearing armour on that run, the Fire Giant's damage output is so mercilessly high that short of the single grace hit that I was allowed from Opaline Bubble Tier, getting hit by anything beyond that meant death, meaning I essentially had to play perfectly. Now, this is hard in phase 1, but at the same time you can get damn good at this phase with enough practice by focusing on its weak left ankle, and the fact that this is simply an easy boss to hit, you really can go to town on it. Its attacks cover massive space and will destroy your health bar if they connect, but they're also very slow, and the frequency of the Fire Giant's attacks is also quite low, making the boss highly punishable. Mind you, gotta give a dishonourable shout out to that initial snowy ground wave it almost always does with its shield at the start of each fight. Seems like the idea is that you're supposed to leap over it with Torrent, but I have never been able to get this to work consistently, always just get nailed mid-jump, though you can just dismount and roll through it. It's the Fire Giant's second phase where things get really ugly, slow and dangerous. Now that leg weak point is gone, and now your attacks deal way less damage. It becomes better to go for the hands and upper body, but this requires baiting out particular attacks rather than you just being allowed to run up and unload, except in between those attacks that you wanted to throw out there are firestorms, fire breath, double fast moving fireballs and double flames of the fell god, any of which will kill you in a single hit. It's the damn slowness in particular that frustrates me about the Fire Giant's second phase. I mean, I highlighted Fortissax as being a long fight due to it having taken me 5 whole minutes, but the Fire Giant took me closer to 8 minutes, with most of that being the second phase, even though it starts off its second phase at only 35 to 40% of its max HP. In spite of all that though, and in spite of my long and difficult ordeal toppling the Fire Giant 2 years ago, I could not have been on this boss for longer than half an hour this time round, for a couple of reasons. 1. I had retained all the lessons I'd learned on my last level 1 run, meaning I still knew how to deal with all the giant's attacks. The second reason I had an easier time was uplifting aromatics. Never before in Elden Ring have I bothered with perfume. Aromatics were a type of item I always just ignored. In fact, I can't usually be bothered with buffs in general. I prefer to just get right in there. Uplifting aromatics raise your attack power by 10%, and it also affects nearby allies, though of course this wasn't relevant to me here. That's nice and all, but that's not what interested me, because its other effect is that it applies the same manner of protective buff as the Opaline Bubble Tier, allowing you to survive a killing blow, and you can carry as many dosages of uplifting aromatics as you have empty perfume bottles and the necessary ingredients. For my winning attempt, I went through 3 uplifting aromatics throughout the entire 8-minute battle, though the last quarter and a bit of the fight were done without any protection at all. Honestly, could barely believe it when I clinched the victory, because I really did come into this resigned to the likelihood that it would probably take several hours, but nope, thanks to my spunk and gumption through my use of uplifting aromatics and my knowledge of all the fire giant's tricks, didn't take too long at all. For as not that bad as it ended up being, I'll still give the fire giant a 4.5 for pain, because I really did need those aromatics. Things would not have ended so quickly were it not for me having multiple of them on hand. For my pleasure rating, I'll give a 5. The first phase alone would get a 7.5, but that sluggish second phase really does bring it down. None of this, however, holds a bloomin' candle, Type 1A, to the eternal, infernal agony which this next god-forsaken, god-skinned boss caused me. Yes, it was time for the Godskin Duo, the granddaddy of horrible bosses, and this time round it was worse than ever. Awful boss at the best of times, quite arguably the worst in the entire game, but even so, there are usually tools and strategies to overcome their agonising shithousery. As usual, I'll refer back to my previous level 1 run, where indeed I came into this arena expecting a horrible time, a proper roadblock in the run, but surprisingly, while I did have a hard time, it wasn't quite as bad as I feared it would be. Biggest reason for this was that you can summon Recusant Bernal for the fight, whose summon sign is just by the fog wall, and of course, you can use Spirit Ashes too, going a long way towards making things more manageable, as opposed to going in solo and getting utterly overwhelmed by 2 very challenging and versatile enemies at once, both of whom have even more problematic second phases, including the Godskin Noble's infamous rolling attack. With the help of my Phantom and my Spirits, though the duo were still very difficult, they ended up not even being in the top 5 hardest encounters back then, and didn't take me an excessive amount of time to overcome. This time though, things were different. In fact, things were so much worse here that it got to the point where I resigned myself to the run probably being over, because this hurdle seemed too high, because as you know, this time I could not summon, and that really sucked. So onto my strategy, sleep pots. Very quickly realised that I'd need to use sleep pots here, which I was fine with. It's kinda cheesy, but so's the damn boss. I've never felt any moral qualms about countering cheddar with some Edam. Here, however, are the 3 problems I ran into. 1. Even with one of them asleep, it still meant having to play nearly flawlessly against the one which was still active. I almost always put the Apostle to sleep in favour of fighting the Noble, because even though the Noble is really tough, I'm just better against its moveset compared to the Apostle. Regardless, my performance simply was not up to scratch. I would inevitably get tagged by something in phase 1, and in the Noble's phase 2 you've got the rolling attack to contend with, which, as well as being tricky to avoid, if you don't manage to get him stuck on a broken pillar, takes forever to end, meaning the Apostle can end up waking up while the Noble's still alive and healthy. Furthermore, the bafflingly fast and unreasonably difficult to avoid Noble Presence attack also starts getting thrown out in phase 2, and good luck dodging that on reaction. My second problem is that I was having an incredibly frustrating time actually landing the sleep pots, because half the time they would just dodge them. I'd go in there with say 6 sleep pots, and it would sometimes take 3 before one would land without the Apostle swerving it. I then surmised that this must be because I was locking on, leading to the game effectively input reading me, much the same as how healing, when at mid-range from a Godskin enemy, almost always triggers them to throw a black flame orb. So I tried free aiming the pots instead, only for them to still just get dodged half the bloody time anyway. Miserable. The third problem I was having was my limited supply of sleep pots, because to make them you need Trina's lilies. Now, there are a lot of Trina's lilies out in the world, but what makes them rare is that they do not respawn. Furthermore, they are not very fun to farm. They can be dropped by the spirit jellyfish near the apostate derelict church in the consecrated snowfields, but the drop rate is really low and it's quite the grind to go through all that, particularly when half of my sleep pots would end up getting wasted in battle anyway. Had to resort to looking up the wiki to gather all the Trina's lilies from the places where they're most concentrated, and while I didn't totally drink the well dry, I did start getting concerned that I would run out soon. The entire affair was not entirely free of revelation, however. For one, I had no idea that there was another entrance to the arena. You don't have to go through that horrible temple past the Banished Knights every time. There's another site of grace by a different fog wall where you can start much closer to the bosses, and this puts you in a more favourable position for chucking a starting sleep pot. You can even put both of them to sleep if you do it right. Another thing I finally ended up doing was changing my weapons, from my shield and Morning Star to a pair of katanas. Put the Dragon Scale Blade in my right hand and the Uchi Katana in my left. The Dragon Scale Blade is a somber weapon and so can't be customised in any way, though its inherent Ash of War is quite a nice one, Ice Lightning Sword, throwing out a bolt of the frostbiting lightning, as well as also imbuing the weapon with an Ice Lightning buff for some time afterwards. For my Uchi Katana, gave it a bleed affinity so that I'd have both frost and bleed on my side. I needed all the help I could get. Was doing more damage now with my dual weapons and fancy buffs, but even so, my god, I was still having such a miserable time with it. And every death was made all the more painful with the knowledge that I was running lower and lower on resources for my sleep pots. This was another fight where I had to leave and come back later a couple of times. In fact, between my first and last attempt at the Godskin Duo, I went off and beat Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, and Mohg. But eventually, even though I was worried it might never happen, I did manage to beat this boss. Instead of me putting the Apostle to sleep and focusing on fighting the Noble straight, I put them both to sleep and unloaded on the Apostle with Ice Lightning Sword and a volley of follow-up attacks. From here I unloaded on the sleeping Noble, though couldn't kill him before the phase 2 transition, meaning I had to deal with his rolling rampage. There was a pillar there, but if he starts rolling too near a pillar, he'll just come over it rather than getting stuck. After the Noble landing a follow-up pancake squash, I went in for the kill and carried on attacking during the death animation. Just like with the 4 kings from Dark Souls 1, you can keep attacking while they're dying to drain their shared health pool. Overall boss health was below 50% here, meaning I was absolutely shiting myself with nerves because I just wanted this blasted ordeal to be over and done with, please. And of course the Apostle dodges my sleep pot, not once but twice, and all the while the clock is ticking before the Noble respawns. Indeed, just before my third sleep pot could take effect, the Noble returned. But rather than be focusing fire on the sleeping Apostle, I knew I had to put the new Noble to sleep as well. I actually took a hit here, though thankfully my Opaline bubble tier was still active, so it did not kill me, and thus did I send the Noble to the Land of Nod. Unloaded on him, but again he survived to initiate phase 2, except this time I was able to get him stuck on a pillar, where I got off an Ice Lightning Sword. Only did minor damage, but it did activate the sword buff, helping me to finish him off thereafter. But oh my god, still a tiny smidgen of health left in the health pool, but thank Christ the Apostle's still asleep. But oh god, why have you forsaken me? He's waking up. Dudes and ladies, this fight absolutely sucked at level 1 with no phantoms, and even when I did succeed, it was through heavy use of sleep pots. In fact, I'll say it outright. If it weren't for the sleep pot strat, I honestly don't think I would ever have been able to beat the Godskin Duo, not least of all because of how downright unpleasant and draining they are to fight. I give this a 10 for pain and a 1 for pleasure. I hated this boss. It sucked and I never want to do it again. In fact, I don't even want to think about it again. Thank God the Godskin Duo are beaten. Surely things are going to settle down a bit now, right? Sadly not. Because next up we have Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, who guards the way into Elfale. The way into Hickel's Haligtree, to begin with, was certainly no walk in the park, because it meant having to go through Ordinate Liturgical Town, which, in my humble opinion, might just be the single worst FromSoft area. The Albinoric archers have too much range, too much health, and deal way too much damage, and navigating around this town to reach the Four Flames is bad enough even without the archers. I really dislike how you have to go through this horrible level in order to make it into the Haligtree, but that's just the way it is, and honestly, it wasn't even that much harder getting through here on level 1 compared to on a normal run, because of how lethal the archers are even when you've got a respectable amount of health. Never mind that though, or the Haligtree itself, which is also quite difficult to run through because it's boss time. Now, notable thing about Loretta is that we've already fought her. It's really the same idea as Margit and Golden Godfrey, who are weaker spirit forms of the real people who you later fight. Indeed, Royal Knight Loretta was easy peasy, and Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, is not a boss who has ever given me any trouble either. In fact, I usually nail her first or second try on normal playthroughs, and that is why I was very surprised at just how difficult she was for me here. In fact, not only was this boss difficult, but it was probably one of the hardest in the run. That's right, Loretta. Note that I was still using my Morning Star for this fight. That's because, as I said, the Godskin Duo was a boss I had to go back to a couple times, with the Loretta and upcoming fight with Mohg sandwiched in between. Started up with the Flame Art Affinity again, with Flaming Strike equipped, but after a while I switched this up because Loretta is actually somewhat resistant to fire. She is not resistant to lightning however, and so I imbued my weapon with the Lightning Affinity, though as far as Ashes of War skills, I ended up not using any at all in my later attempts because none of them really fit with the pace and nature of this fight. The interesting thing with Loretta is that there's really nothing about her that's in any way truly bullshit. I mean, yeah, she does have powerful magics at her disposal, and carrying Phalanx is never fun to deal with because of how you need to back off when they are active. But it is a relatively straight fight against a mounted enemy. My struggles weren't caused by any particular attack or anything, but rather I just found her to be really hard to get good at. I think the reason I've always found her so easy before is that she's not super powerful. In a normal run you can get tagged a bunch of times and survive and keep on trucking, but here, nope. Everything kills you in one, with the possible exception of one of her carrying Phalanx projectiles. You'd maybe be able to survive one of those, but I'm not sure because I don't think I got tagged by one a single time. It was her melee attacks that kept on getting me, and I was somehow surprised every damn time. I found not only the timings to get strangely difficult to get attuned to, but also the range of her glaive. There were so many times where I would be sure I was a safe distance away from her attack, or that it would swoosh past me where I was standing, but nope. Her melee attacks have surprising range and excellent tracking. She does have that fancy jumping twirly stuff she does in Phase 2, but that move really wasn't much of an issue for me here. It was her basic attacks that kept on catching me out, and I found it really frustrating because there just felt like no good reason for it. After the first few times I died, I thought, okay, yeah, warm up over now, let's just get this done please, only for me to still be fighting her 2 bloody hours later. When I did win, it wasn't even due to any particular factor or stratagem either. I just managed to play well enough and only got hit once. I give Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, a 7.5 for pain. Not because she's a bad boss or that there was any particularly frustrating element of her mechanics or moveset, but because this just took me way longer than it should have and it bugged me. And bear in mind that the Godskin Duo were still looming large in my mind during this. On the pleasure scale, I'll give Loretta a 4.5. Yes, there was pain, but it's not like I hated fighting her or anything. She's fine. She kicked my arse, but she's fine. Now that the way to Elfale was clear, I could have marched right in and down to the arboreal abode of the Goddess of Rot, but I wanted to leave that for close to last. I did make sure to pick up Marika's Source Seal while I was here though, which I occasionally used in conjunction with Radagon's Source Seal. This made my defense extremely low, but at this point in the run that didn't matter because everything was a one-hit KO anyway. I'd even stopped wearing the Ritual Shield Talisman because the 30% defense buff wasn't making a difference anymore. Stats aside though, my choices at this point were either Malenia, Malekith, Placidusax or Mohg, and I chose the latter option. Mohg is and always has been one of those bosses that I find to be very hard, but also absolutely fantastic. Straight up S tier. Again though, he is damn hard, and his second phase is notorious for being incredibly intense and busy, not just from his array of airborne swoops, long-range trident thrusts and blood flame explosions, but also the blood flame embers which linger on the ground, sprayed out from his trident after various attacks. Not only do these damage you, but they cause bleed buildup, and just as my vulnerability to Deathblight was increased back in the Fortissax fight due to my lack of armour, the same is true here for bleed. Back in my early days of Elden Ring, Mohg's first phase also gave me heaps of trouble. Took me time to come to terms with the deceptive range of his trident, and to get used to the timings for his melee attacks. Not to mention all that blood flame nonsense, like that claw attack where even though it looks like it should, the initial claw mark doesn't do any damage, just the explosion which comes directly after. Thankfully, all those previous hours of struggle left me with a lingering degree of competency and familiarity with Mohg, to the point that his first phase really didn't cause me that much trouble, particularly with how punishable he is during those 3 countdown slashes. There were times when I was able to wreak bloody havoc on his health bar throughout the duration of the first phase, but of course, unless you happen to be strong and fast enough to kill Mohg before the transition, he gets a ton of that health back. It's always so bloody deflating to see this happen too. A boss going into a more difficult phase 2 at around 50% HP is one thing, but when you get him down to 40% in phase 1 before they climb back up to 70%, it's such a bummer. It's a bloody bummer is what it is. Yes, phase 2 really was the troublesome part here, and no wonder. Mohg's moveset gets expanded, there's way more burning blood flying every which way, and he's significantly less passive, regularly erupting into frenzied flights from one side of the arena to the other, making it one of those fights where if you get unlucky with his behaviour, you can easily go for a damn minute without being able to get any damage off, just by trying to stay alive. Had the same weapon loadout here as I had for the Godskins, again making good use of the Dragonscale Blade's Ice Lightning Sword, and I managed to get 1 or 2 bleeds off with the Uchigatana too. I know I've spoken a lot about enemy damage output through this video, but I realise I've spoken very little about my damage output. The fact is, at almost no point in this entire run was I dissatisfied with my damage. With the right setups, you can always overcome the limitations placed upon you in low-level runs throughout these games, but Elden Ring has so many different build possibilities that it's particularly easy to turn yourself into a glass cannon, even without having to think about it all that much. I mean, you saw me use the Morning Star for most of this run, but that wasn't because of any strategic decision or because there weren't better alternatives at the time. It was just because it was working fine, as would have many other weapons. Back to Mohg though, it took me a good couple of hours to take him down, though my frustrations throughout were quite minor thanks to the regularity in which I'd make it to phase 2. For as highly as I think of Mohg, I still wouldn't say his bloodier phase is totally free of bullshit, because this fight can become so difficult to manage when there's too much blood flame everywhere, and there's barely anywhere to even move to. And all the while here comes Mohg flying at you from 10 meters away, very easy to become overwhelmed with it all and just get wrecked. That said, it was really just a matter of perseverance. It was like, look, you are fighting Mohg at level 1, it's going to be really hard and hectic and you will die a whole bunch of times, This is just a fact. After a bit of time though, I got him after taking just a single hit, and you know what? It was a fine battle. I give Morg a 4.5 on the pain scale. Yes, he was very difficult and I died a lot, but it wasn't all that painful or unpleasant, just very challenging. Gonna give him a 7 for pleasure too, because even though I think he's one of the best bosses in the game, the pleasure of fighting him becomes somewhat diminished when you are forced to play nearly flawlessly, which you really do have to do with every boss at this late juncture in the run. Yep, Morg's a pretty cool guy, damn enjoyable boss for me, always has been. Malekith though? I'm afraid not, folks. Malekith is a lot of people's favourite Elden Ring boss, and I get why. There's plenty of stuff out there that other people enjoy, but which just isn't for me, like Pink Floyd or Baldur's Gate 3. I don't like these things, but I do respect them enough. Respect or not though, Malekith has always been a major thorn in my side, regardless of what level I happen to be at when fighting him. Beast Clergyman I'm pretty much fine with. Don't get me wrong, he's still really hard, but I actually enjoy this phase somewhat. It's very demanding of your reflexes, but it has a certain fast flow to it that I find to be quite enjoyable, which is not the case with Phase 2. There are some attacks that Malekith throws out in Phase 2 that even after 2.5 years of playing Elden Ring, I still don't know how to deal with. I'm speaking mainly about his Black Flame AoE explosions. I know there are ways to deal with every single one of his moves. I know it's all avoidable and manageable if you know what you're doing, but that shit always ends up hitting me regardless of what I do to try and desperately avoid it. You get to Phase 2 and Malekith starts flipping from power to power and throwing out massive sweeping sword attacks and devastating AoE moves that are tinged with the draining taint of Black Flame, and I just don't like it. Malekith is no fun for me on a good day. On a level 1 day, even worse. All I'll say is thank God for the Blasphemous Claw item. Before you can use the Blasphemous Claw though, you have to acquire it, and this ended up being much harder to accomplish than I could ever have managed. Than I could ever have imagined. The special item is dropped by Recusant Bernal, who spawns in just before the chest containing the Old Lord's Talisman in Crumbling Faram Azula. And this is a fight I've had to go through many times before, because I always end up having to use the Blasphemous Claw to scrape a Malekith victory, so that I can move on to bosses I actually enjoy fighting. Bernal is hard though, primarily because of his weapon, the Devourer's Scepter, a great hammer with one of my most hated Ash of War skills, Devourer of Worlds. The area of effect for this skill is absolutely obscene. You can see how ridiculously wide it is from the red circular area when the move is performed, but this is deceptive because in truth it's even wider still. There were several times when I was sure I was out of range, only for me to still get caught in the red blast anyway, despite being just outside of the circle, and needless to say, it's a one-hit KO. I've heard that you can jump over the attack to avoid it, and I'm sure people aren't lying about this, but I'm telling you, I tried it, and I simply got hit in mid-air anyway, so I don't know. Even aside from this move, Bernal is a formidable and tanky opponent who you need to be extremely careful with when hitting, because if he manages to poise through your attack without getting at all staggered, then you're dying from his counter swing. I only recorded me dying a couple of times to Bernal, but seriously, he took me over an hour to beat and I did not enjoy it, but I had to do it. I needed that claw. Even with the Blasphemous Claw, both Beast Clergyman and Malekith gave me a hell of a run for my money. I tried some experimentation with my build here. In fact, I even briefly tried out the Bloodflame Blade incantation, but it was kinda rubbish, so I just stopped. Pulled out my trusty Flaming Strike, but again, damage increase simply wasn't very impressive. I resorted to Chilling Mist, just like I'd used against Fortissax, and while it was good at applying Frostbite, it was again a bit redundant when I'd have been able to apply Frostbite through attacking anyway. All this frost got me thinking though. You know an Ash of War I'd always heard was superb but that I'd never before tried? Ice Spear. You can't use Ice Spear with a katana though, and so it was time for yet another build shift, where I hung up my Dragon Scale Blade and Uchigatana for a pike and spear, and indeed, although I would later exchange my pike for an Iron Spear, I would go on to use dual-wielded spears for the remainder of the run. Turned out everyone was right about Ice Spear too, because it did great damage, caused frost build-up, and of course was ranged, though its range did leave a bit to be desired. If you trigger it close to an enemy though, it does a wee bit of minor AoE damage too, which is nice. I will say that my damage output from double attacks with the spears was considerably worse than my damage from dual katanas. But on the other hand, I preferred the speed and range of the double spear attack, and it only seemed to be this boss that had some resistance to the thrust damage for whatever reason. For as excellent as the Blasphemous Claw is, I still find it quite intimidating to try and use, but it does feel fantastic when you land a successful parry with it, which is what I did to finally defeat Malekith, following it up with a couple of Ice Spears, the second of which got me a much appreciated stagger, after which I finished the beast off with my third and final Ice Spear. I didn't like Malekith before returning to it for this run, but you know what? After thinking about it, yeah, I still don't like him. This was a boss I always knew I'd be able to overcome, but I also knew it probably wouldn't be much fun, and I was correct. I give Malekith an 8 on the pain scale, though I was never under any illusions that it would be any different. And for pleasure, I give him a 4, because even though Phase 2 ain't my bag, I've got nothing against the Beast Clergyman. Just 5 more bosses to go folks, 4 remembrance bosses and 1 obnoxious prick standing in the way of 2 of them, which brings us to Gideon Ofnir. No exaggeration here, alright? Gideon Ofnir was one of the toughest, most infuriating and awful bosses of my last level 1 run. I know that might sound unlikely, but trust me, if you let this guy get going, he will give you hell with his constant sorcery and incantation spamming, with his most obnoxious attack being triple Rings of Light thanks to their outrageous area of effect, and the fact that they go forward and back again, though pretty much everything Gideon does here is designed to cause you frustration and failure. He's small as hell, sure, but just like with Fia's champions, that don't matter. He's still a goddamn menace, and in the worst possible way, which is a good thing. I set things right on this attempt.
I knew you'd come to stand before the Elden Ring, to become Elden. What a sad state. I commend you, but alas, she'll take the throne. Queen Margit has high hopes for us, if we continue until I rule.
Gideon Ofnir, f*** you and the horse you rode in on, you old prick. If I was giving this boss a pain rating on my last run, I swear it would be a bloody 9.5, but because I nailed him first try this time round, I'll be magnanimous and hand out a 1.5. Though for pleasure, you know what, I'll give out a 9 for the sheer cathartic thrill of ending him in 20 seconds flat. But now, it's Godfrey time. Godfrey, first Elden Lord, is one of the best bosses ever created. In fact, he is my second favourite FromSoft boss, just after Dark Souls 3's Slave Knight Agheel. He's bloody brilliant in every way and I love fighting him. Ah, but is that still true in a level 1 run? Yes it is. As I passed through the boss arena, I certainly still expected an epic challenge regardless of my respect and affection for this incredible man. I mean, sure I am good at this fight, but it doesn't matter how good you are at something, only being able to tank a single hit throughout the entire battle is always rough. I came in expecting potentially a 1 to 2 hour long sequence of attempts before I was warmed up and conditioned enough to get a victory here, but what actually happened was that I started kicking his arse straight away. Got through to phase 2 on my very first attempt before getting my chest ripped open, and I achieved much the same in my second attempt before my third attempt came along, whereupon once again my chest was brutally ripped open. Yep, I am definitely considerably more adept at dealing with Godfrey, first Elden Lord, than I am at withstanding the earth-shaking raw might of Horror Lu. His second phase never fails to intimidate me, to get me scrambling away and panic rolling. His attacks and grabs are brutal and they give me a hard time, but in a way that I still like. Hoaraloo's just so freaking badass. Thankfully, this battle would not go the way of Mohg, where getting past phase 1 became relatively simple, but where phase 2 had me stuck for hours. Instead, after just a couple of handfuls of attempts, this humble, deprived Tarnish was able to defeat the first Elden Lord without taking a single hit. And let me tell you, it's battles like this one that makes runs like this feel so fulfilling. I know there's that whole weird masochistic thing with some Souls players where the prospect of dying hundreds of times throughout a playthrough is romanticised, as if the fun part of these games is dying. Me myself personally, as a person, I don't get it. I accept that failure is a part of the process with these games, but the challenge and prospect of victory is what draws me in, not dying a ton. And when that challenge is amplified through challenge runs, the feeling of achievement is similarly amplified in a very fun and compelling way. The levels of fun are of course not equal from boss to boss, hence the whole pain and pleasure aspect of this video, but fights like this one with Godfrey where I took on a boss I loved, increased his threat level by increasing my vulnerability, and then still came out on top, well, I mean it's just good shit, isn't it? Not quite sure what my larger point is here, I kinda got lost, verbally. The ratings though, the meter, the scale. I give Godfrey a 2 for pain on account of me having my chest torn apart a few times, but for pleasure, I'm handing out a perfect 10. This was the most enjoyable fight in the whole run and I loved it. Faram Azula was generally not a happy place for me thanks to the Godskin Duo, Malekith, and the fact that for the first time ever Alexander actually managed to kill me. I was not done with the place yet however, because Dragonlord Placidusax still lived, the colossal draconic rock floating silently in the Colosseum beyond time. I think Placidusax is FromSoft's most awesome visual design for a dragon, and I love the actual fight too. Placidusax used to be my all-time favourite FromSoft dragon fight, but with the arrival of the DLC's Bale the Dread, the Dragonlord was dethroned in my eyes. I still love him though. Really wasn't many dragon fights at all in this run, just Agheel who I didn't even need to beat, Fortissax who was a bit of a bloody nightmare, and now Placidusax who is considerably more unique than those other two, yet still considerably formidable for a level 1 chump like yours truly. Biggest headache right off the bat is getting to the boss. The run back isn't one of FromSoft's longest, but it's still about 3 times as long as I think it should be. It gets so tedious having to jump down the rocks every time. A stake of Marika would have gone a long way here, but of course, just like in the Academy of Rea Lucaria, there are none in this level. I get the lore reasons for that and everything, but for God's sake, couldn't we have had some more lore appropriate alternative, like a stake of Malekith or something? Like Fortissax, Placidusax is an ancient dragon, and as such he has a myriad of red lightning attacks, including AoE ones that focus in on your current position before erupting out in a circle after a few seconds. It's not too dissimilar to what Fortissax uses, except it's not constant throughout the fight and is far easier to manage. With Placidusax being so massive, this fight is a fairly slow paced one that's far more about good positioning and knowing when to back off, rather than one where you can simply run in and pound him to hell. I made that error on my last level 1 run, where this was quite a problematic boss for me. I remember just not being able to figure out how to deal decent damage without getting nailed by the golden flames or claws of red lightning. As with a few other bosses though, I largely retained the lessons of the past and came into this challenge already mentally prepared. Had the same weapon setup as I'd used in the fight with Godfrey, ready with my bleed and frost, with Ice Spear again proving very useful, though not quite essential. A lot of my attacks were focused on the dragon's tail. Placidusax does counter this with Fire Breath aimed behind him, but if you're expecting this, it's fairly easy to get out of the way in time before coming back in for a few more attacks afterwards. Phase 2's a scary one due to how big the boss's attacks become. I mean, those airborne red lightning dives can deal massive damage on a regular run for sure, but it's not the amount of damage that's the issue here, but rather just getting hit by anything. I thought I timed my roll perfectly here, but no, got caught in the follow-up AoE blast anyway, and there goes my Opaline Bubble Tier protection, damn it. Really though, my biggest concern in Phase 2 wasn't the Thundercloud assaults, but Placidusax's ruin. Thank God then that there's such an effective way to deal with it. If you position yourself close to a wall when he flies in for his ultimate attack, you will be completely out of harm's way for the entire prolonged sequence, free to poke him to oblivion. I really am glad this method exists, because otherwise I still have no idea how to come away from Placidusax's ruin unscathed. This attack is nuts. I really went hard at the jumping attacks here so that I can get a clutch stagger, and indeed I did, allowing me to finish the Dragonlord off. If this was my first time attempting Placidusax at level 1, would have taken me a lot longer to learn, but I came in already knowing what was what, and in a fight of this flavour where the pace is slower, and when there's not a huge focus on fast and consistent reactions to constant attacks, knowing is half the battle. I give Placidusax a 3.5 for pain and a 7 for pleasure. It was a fun fight that thankfully didn't take many attempts to beat, though that bloody run back always leaves me a bit sore. With the Dragonlord down, however, that left just 2 battles to go, and for the remainder of the final act, the pain levels will rise dramatically. OMG, it's Malenia. It's the big one, it's Big Bertha. Malenia was the most important fight of this entire run for me, because she's the only Remembrance boss I was never able to take down 2 years ago. You've gotta believe me, I tried and tried and tried, and I put God knows how many hours into her, over 20 for sure. But after about 10 hours of attempts, I noticed something concerning. I noticed that I no longer seemed to be getting any better. My level of skill seemed to have reached a plateau, and unfortunately that plateau simply wasn't high enough. Didn't give up there though, oh no. I attempted her for another 10 hours after that, over another couple of days, but try as I might, I just felt like I was banging my head against a wall, and I've got to say, it was not fun for me at all. I made the point earlier in the video that I'm fine with the boss taking a long time to beat, and that I'm okay with dying as long as I'm improving and that I know the boss's downfall is a simple inevitability, but for Malenia, it wasn't. Not only did she stop being fun, but I became miserable. After a while I stopped fighting her and went off to take down Radagon and Elden Beast, which was also hellish in its own way, but when I returned to Malenia, still no success, and I got sick to death of it. Furthermore, I was uncomfortable with the compulsion I felt to just keep fighting her again and again and again, making myself more miserable and grouchy with every failure, to the point where I eventually said enough was enough. Whereupon I dramatically passed my character onto New Game Plus, meaning it was now impossible for me to attempt Malenia anymore. Even despite my shortcomings with the notorious Goddess of Rot, I was still really happy back then with how I'd done in that run against every other Remembrance boss, so it's not like I bore a grudge or anything, but even so, damn, it would have felt good to have beaten her. Well, here we are 2 years later, and once again Candle Type 1A was to challenge Malenia, but this time he would prevail. I don't know why I'm speaking in the third person, sorry. I was pretty nervous going in because I already knew that I was going to be here for a while and that it was going to be painful. That wasn't me being pessimistic or defeatist or anything, I just knew it was going to be very difficult. Thankfully, I'd long ago figured out how to deal with every one of Malenia's attacks in Phase 1. Well, apart from that one. I know when to dodge in response to all her attacks and which direction to dodge in, and I know when and when not to go in for punishes, but while knowledge and understanding massively helps in fights against foes like Astel or Placidusax, a boss like Malenia also requires tight, consistent execution, and that was often my downfall. It's not enough to just know how to avoid something, you have to execute it correctly every time, and although Malenia is quite passive at mid to long range, the frequency of her attacks at close range is high. She's a boss that demands a lot out of the player, and when you can only tank a single hit, that demand can be overwhelming. On the bright side, Malenia's ability to drain health when she lands a hit is a complete non-issue when you fight her at level 1, because if she does get off more than one hit on you, you're dead anyway, so who cares. Now let's discuss the elephant in the room, Waterfowl Dance. I don't like this attack. It's one that a lot of players were absolutely outraged at in the early days of Elden Ring, where after getting completely destroyed by it, lots of us rightly asked, what the hell am I supposed to do about that then? There are multiple ways to avoid it of course, but compared to almost any other attack in any FromSoft game, it feels so jarring that this one felt so disproportionately difficult to deal with. I've heard some people say that this is a good thing, that the game shouldn't solely be about dodge timings, that they enjoyed how avoiding the move required excellent positioning too. While I actually agree with that general sentiment, I certainly don't enjoy the extent to which positioning is vital with this attack. On my last level 1 run, this attack was my biggest enemy. Don't get me wrong, I died a ton to Malenia's regular attacks too, as I did in this run also. But when it came to Waterfowl Dance, I resented the lack of control I felt. I'd watch YouTube tutorials on how to deal with it, I'd try them out in the fight, end up surviving, and I'd think, hey, maybe I'm actually getting the hang of this. And then the next time she'd use the move, I would get caught up by the storm of blades anyway. Though admittedly, nerves and intimidation were definitely a big part of that. I mean, once she's at around 70% HP, she can throw it out at any time. Sometimes she'll use it straight after falling below that threshold, and sometimes she won't, meaning you now need to play hyper cautiously until she does. Because if you go in anyway and you're mid attack animation and she rears up to unleash it, congratulations, you're f***ed. I know there's that weird maneuver you can do where you circle her while she's in the air to throw off her tracking, but I've never been able to pull it off, and I think it's insane that you should have to pull off something like that. Something so specific and janky just to be able to survive an attack. For as much as I'm whining about Waterfowl Dance though, I will say that I definitely improved my game this time round. Died a lot to it again for sure, but after a while, as long as I was at least mid-range when she initiated the attack, I became reasonably comfortable in coming out unscathed. First got to run away and then jump in time with the first flurry, and then roll into her next flurry in the exact direction of where her body is, just as it starts, and then whilst locked onto her, simply back up without rolling to avoid the final flurry. There are other variations on this of course, but this ended up working well for me. If she started to move up when I was at close range to her though, there was not a single time where I survived. Thus, while yes, my relationship with Waterfowl Dance did improve throughout this playthrough, no, I still don't like it. As for Phase 2, well, it's like Phase 1, but harder. Waterfowl Dance persists, except with the added element of Scarlet Rot. Though just as with her health draining powers, Scarlet Rot was a non-issue here, due to the lethality of her attacks, regardless of any status effects. I'll tell you a move that has, historically, gotten me way more than it really should, and that's that bloody Scarlet Aeonia attack she always starts the phase off with. Just the length of the startup animation compared to the dizzying speed at which it is unleashed. I've seen some folk move in a way that throws off her tracking with this attack, but I eventually learnt to deal with it by simply standing still and then timing the roll forward and out of the way at the right time. As if all that wasn't enough though, Malenia has another attack that is the bane of my level 1 life, and that's her phase 2 Valkyrie clone attack. This is another one where I just lose confidence when I see her gearing up for it because I find it so difficult and weird to deal with. Simply trying to roll in time with her clones coming out has a very low chance of success and will almost always get you caught out at least once, and this is another move where your position in relation to the boss plays a massive part in determining your chances of survival, which again I don't like, because it's not like you know when the move is going to come out, or even if it's going to be used at all. By far the most effective strategy that I tried was to simply start running back and to the left as soon as you see this attack start. If she starts it when you're too close, you're probably dead, and if she starts it when you're already near the wall of the arena and have nowhere to run back to, again, death follows. In those occasions where I was lucky enough to be positioned favourably, however, I was usually able to deal with this attack, but I hate that I have to hope that I fulfilled these criteria when she uses it, because you've also got Waterfowl Dance to worry about, same with all her other attacks, and on top of it all, Phase 2 Malenia is far more aggressive than she is in Phase 1. I tweaked my build a few times with Malenia because I was at the point in the game where optimization really did matter. It was time to shed all excess fat and optimise my damage output and mechanics. I started off with my Cold Pike and Bloody Spear, with Ice Spear being my Ash of War of choice, but I found that the animation for the skill was just a bit too slow here, and that I wasn't able to safely use it as much as I needed to, and when I did manage to get one off at mid-range, Malenia would often simply dodge it. So after a while of that, I converted my Spear from Blood to Cold to try and maximise the magic damage I was doing with my melee attacks, and instead of Ice Spear, I brought out the big guns. I brought out Piercing Fang. In my opinion, Piercing Fang as well as Impaling Thrust are among the best Ashes of War in the game. Excellent damage, excellent stagger potential, relatively quick animation, modest FP cost and incredible range, which was especially the case here because I had the skill equipped onto the pike, which already has great range. And because it was a cold pike, every time I hit her with Piercing Fang, it also caused frost buildup. Even with my choice to focus in with this build, I still died many more times to Malenia, and there were long stretches where I'd suddenly be unable to even get her to phase 2. After many deaths to Waterfowl Dance and her clone attack and everything else, eventually, for the first time in my life, I managed to beat Malenia at level 1. I won't pretend I didn't get a little bit lucky here because she behaved more passively than normal in Phase 2, which I took full advantage of, but yes, finally I had defeated Malenia, and spirits were high, because now the Goddess of Rot had met her match. I give Malenia an 8.5 on the pain scale and a 6 for pleasure. You might have expected me to hand out another 10 for pain, but honestly, for as difficult a time as I had, it was nowhere near as bad as it was on my last run. Didn't take me anywhere near as long to beat her as I feared it might, and also unlike last time, I never reached the point where I stopped having fun this time round, which was nice. It's nice to have fun, isn't it? We're not done yet though, because with Malenia defeated, it was time for the final battle against Radagon and Elden Beast. Like I said, Malenia was the looming threat throughout this whole run. Even though I had made things even harder this time round with my no armor and no summoning rules, with the exception of the Godskin Duo, the only other boss I wasn't totally sure I would be able to beat was Malenia, but beat her I did. As for Radagon and Elden Beast, I remember them giving me a significant amount of trouble before. Had a very difficult time, but I had beaten them and I also really like them. Radagon's actually one of my favourite bosses. Thus, even though I knew they'd be a big challenge for me here, I wasn't too worried as I passed through the Golden Fog and into the Erdtree, but as I'd come to realise, I should have been very worried. I'll just start off by telling you now, this was the single most difficult boss of the entire run. Yes, the Godskin Duo were probably the most painful, but that was largely because that's not a straight up fight, the whole thing's bullshit. This battle though, there's no other way to say it other than it's just really f***ing hard at level 1. Things started off really promisingly too, because I'm actually pretty damn decent at fighting Radagon. Didn't do tremendous on my first try, but neither did I die straight away, and on my second attempt I got Radagon down to about 20% HP, which I was very happy with. However, despite this, Radagon turned out to be no pushover. The dude just has a lot of attacks and combos with weird timings, and just like with Malenia, a high level of high frequency precision and execution is demanded of you. When you can tank a whole bunch of hits throughout the fight, it's still a big challenge, but when you can tank just one, it is a fast-paced game of sudden death, where you simply have to be near flawlessly focused at all times. Radagon's first phase transition is very consistent and goes a long way towards making the battle feel more structured and grounded in logic, where he does the golden foot stomp, which can be easily avoided with a jump attack, and then the follow-up hammer strike, which can be easily rolled. But it's his other phase transition attack that has always given me grief, his triple hammer slam. The hitboxes for this move are so weird. It seems like such a textbook example of a move that you're simply supposed to jump to in time with his slams. Except every time I used to try this, I just get hit in mid-air anyway. I also used to try and run to the left or right, but he tracks you insanely well throughout this whole attack, and try as I might, I'd usually end up still getting hit. And this was damn frustrating. Getting good at the boss, but then knowing that when Radagon pulls this move out, as he always does, you're probably going to die. I've seen people stand super close to him and jump in time with all 3 slams, but again this was very inconsistent with me, and visually inconsistent too. It was that thing where I didn't understand what I was doing wrong. It looked like I was timing it correctly, and it looked like I was jumping free of the blast, but it didn't matter what it looked like, the hitbox had other ideas. Well, this time I did eventually work out how to avoid it with 90% consistency, and the key for the first 2 strikes is not just to roll, but to roll forward. You can even let off an attack while you do this. And for the big third hit, got to sprint like hell around him. Radagon will track you like mad when you do this, but just do it anyway, and then at the last second, roll past him to make it clear of the explosion. Just like Waterfowl Dance, I still don't like this attack, but I did get better at dealing with it. As for my build, although I started off using cold weapons and piercing fang which had worked so well for Malenia, after discovering that Radagon was weak to fire, I went back to using the flame art affinity with the flaming strike Ash of War, made even more powerful with the fire scorpion charm, and the flame shrouding cracked tear equipped within my wondrous flask, and despite me being level 1, my damage output with this setup was awesome. Got to a point where each attempt at Radagon started to feel nearly scripted due to how consistent I became with my damage, attacks and staggers, and it was a lot of fun. Yes indeed, if the final battle simply consisted of a fierce fight with Radagon, then all would be well, and after a few attempts I'd have had things done and dusted. But as we know folks, we're only halfway done, which brings us to Elden Beast, where the pain really began. The Elden Beast aspect of this battle was beyond brutal. I mean, there's the fact that Radagon has to be beaten all over again every time you die, but that's not the only reason this was so rough. The other reasons all stem from the Elden Beast's moveset. This is a surprisingly complex enemy with a lot of attacks. To the point where you can fight it 8 times in a row and think you know what it's all about. And then on the 9th time it'll pull out some move you forgot it could even use and which you have no idea how to deal with. Whereas the fight with Radagon is fast, frantic and tight, the Elden Beast battle is slower. It's about figuring out which grand explosive attack it's going to do next and being confident in avoiding it, and turned out I guess I lacked confidence, because I suck at dealing with this moveset. Even its golden laser volley got me way too many times, even when I was running at full speed to avoid them, and this was inconsistent too. Sometimes I'd run and they'd all miss, and sometimes halfway through my sprint I would get taken out. I read online that you've got to run at a sort of slant to reliably avoid the lasers, but again, sometimes this worked and sometimes it didn't, though the overhead version of the attack when it comes out really quickly after the beast dives up out of the water was especially difficult for me to react to. One thing I didn't try against this attack anywhere near as often as I really should have was to try and outrun it with Torrent, but yeah, this attack gave me a lot of trouble, and again, it was that feeling of it seeming like a bit of a gamble whether or not I'd survive at any time it was used, as opposed to me knowing exactly what to do and when to do it. Another frequent cause of difficulty I had was being able to tell precisely what the boss was doing. Gotta get close to it to attack, yet by doing that it can be tough to discern what attack it is gearing up for next. Is it safe to stick around and keep attacking, or is it better to run the hell away? Sometimes I just couldn't tell. And while we're here talking about attacking, whereas Radagon was weak against fire and vulnerable to frostbite, the Elden Beast ain't weak to a single goddamn thing. Not one element and not one status effect. But above all that, I would say the single biggest problem for me in this whole battle was Elden Stars. In fact, the only way I'd managed to solve the Elden Stars conundrum on my last level 1 run was to use an exploit, where you kind of run anti-clockwise around the boss when it starts doing the animation, causing Elden Stars tracking to totally fail, where it will harmlessly float off in a different direction from you. I tried it a couple of times again here but couldn't get it to work, so not sure if it's been patched or if I was just doing it wrong. Aside from that, something that initially seemed obvious to me was to just get up on Torrent and simply ride away from Elden Stars. Couldn't do this 2 years ago of course because this hadn't been patched in yet, but surely it was the ideal solution. To my horror though, it just didn't work. Even when galloping away at full speed, I'd get nicked by the damaging particles anyway, and don't forget that even when you're straining to avoid Elden Stars, it's not like the boss is sitting there doing nothing. It's throwing other lasers and explosions and sword beams at you that you also have to dodge, and it's all so outrageously shit. After a while, it started to dawn on me that I would need to take alternative measures to handle Elden Stars. I would need to use the Crimson Whirl Bubble Tier in my Wondrous Flask, a buff which converts any and all elemental damage into health for 15 seconds, totally cancelling out the incoming damage from Elden Stars, provided you activate it late enough so that the buff doesn't run out while the attack is still running amok. Sounds like a pretty ideal and obvious solution, right? Well, here was the issue with it. There's always an issue. The big issue is that if I have to save my Wondrous Flask for the second phase of the Elden Beast fight when it uses Elden Stars, then I can't rely on my Opaline Bubble Tier to protect me from a single hit during the Radagon fight, or throughout the first half of the Elden Beast fight for that matter, meaning I essentially needed to beat Radagon and the first half of the Elden Beast hitless every single time. Remember when I was speaking about Malenia and how on my first run I reached a point where things stopped becoming fun and instead became miserable? Yeah, that happened here. Instead of me confidently tearing through Radagon's health bar with gay abandon on most attempts like I was before, now I was lucky to get through Radagon at all. I'm good at this boss, but I'm not that good. I'm not Mr. Perfect. My confidence crumbled into dust, and all of a sudden I was dying to Radagon constantly. And when I did manage to get through to Elden Beast and shit the bed to its golden lasers, or just from some big scary sword blast attack, my morale crumbled all the more. I changed my setup to defend against Elden Stars, but the fact was that I was barely even able to get that far into the Elden Beast fight to use it in the first place. Eventually I made the decision to abandon the Flaming Strike stratagem I had going against Radagon in favour of good old Piercing Fang. Because while Flaming Strike was excellent against Radagon, it wasn't good at all against Elden Beast, whereas Piercing Fang was fantastic and had a better chance at netting me a much needed stagger against the final boss. And well, after I don't know how many attempts, after a cumulative total of about 12 hours of effort, eventually, after a great deal of pain, frustration and failure, I won. I give Radagon and Elden Beast a 9.5 for pain and a 4 for pleasure. I genuinely do like this battle, but the difficulties posed by doing it at level 1 with no help from summons are beyond substantial, and it was a major, frustrating grind getting through it. In fact, it might be the single hardest thing I've ever done in a game, and needless to say, I'm glad it's over with. And there you have it folks, there is my Elden Ring Level 1 run. I underwent a great many trials and tribulations throughout, but honestly I'm pretty damn happy with how I performed. I was actually generally quite surprised at how quickly I was getting through the bosses, though that only served to make major roadblocks like Fia's champions, Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree and the Godskin Duo all the more grating. I expected the major threat of the run to be Malenia, going in knowing that there was a high likelihood that she'd take a long time to beat, but Godskin Duo aside, turned out that the real villain was Radagon and Elden Beast all along. Who could have thought? Could I have made this run even harder still? Of course. Could have done it with unreinforced weapons, not used Cold and Bleed, and not have equipped any talismans or used any Ashes of War, but seriously folks, that's not for me. This video was never about me showing off how good I am at Elden Ring. I don't give a crap about how good I am at games, I just like having fun. But as you all know, I'm not exactly done yet, am I? Because there's still Shadow of the Erdtree. As hard as this playthrough was, I had beaten near all these bosses at level 1 before, but that is not the case with the DLC's bosses, and at this point, I'm not entirely sure if I'm more excited at the prospect of taking on those near immovable mountains of difficulty, or terrified. One thing is for damn sure though, I'm going to give it a bloody good go, and that's almost certainly going to be what my next video is. Wish me luck. Furthermore, I'd like to turn this into a wee series of mine where I do the same for Bloodborne, the Dark Souls games, and then perhaps Demon Souls and Sekiro, but ultimately that depends on whether people are interested. If no one likes or watches this video, then I probably won't spend a month at a time making more, but if you do like it, I'd be happy to. And on that note, I think we'll draw this episode to a close. I truly hope you enjoyed this wee experiment of mine, because I enjoyed putting it together. As always, cheers for watching, and cheerio.